The story begins on a dark night in the lands of Drax prison, under the light of the full moon. The guards walk down the hall to visit a blonde prisoner with long hair. A man with a royal appearance, dressed in beautiful clothes and with yellow eyes, approached the girl. He stared at the girl and began to explain that he needed the prisoner's help. The girl thought for a moment, chuckled, and ran her hand through her hair. She asked what kind of help they expected from her. The man and the girl were standing in the cell and staring at each other, wanting to find contact. The man looked the prisoner in the eyes again and told her that he needed to become emperor. The prisoner girl looked at him in surprise and didn't understand at all what he was thinking of her. She wondered if the guy really wanted to stage a coup against his father, the emperor. He was on the throne, and his brother was next, and he was the youngest. Sometimes having competitors is simply a convention. You just need to find a way to get rid of them. The prisoner, shaking her head and thinking that he certainly couldn't be the emperor, she asked if His Highness was sure. The prince looked at her and saw that her stomach was twisting because she had heard a lot about His Majesty. She agreed with his observation and said that there was no one in the empire who was not familiar with his person. He was known as the invincible monster of the border, the Black Wolf, and the one whose brain was made entirely of muscles, the shame of the family. His name was Rixit van Hexen, and he was cruel and warlike, but without the elegance and arrogance of the ruling family. Rixit van Hexen preferred actions to words and fists to any law. There were also unpleasant rumors circulating throughout the empire that no woman had ever looked in His Majesty's direction. The emperor, hoping to get rid of him, gave him a barren land on the border called Drax. Rixit, despite this, did the best he could, and no enemy could cross that border. The girl concluded that he was not meant to rule, and that only the intelligent and cunning rule, not the strong and cruel. Rixit started to say that he probably knew he wasn't very smart. The girl laughed and said she understood. He brought his finger to his head and said that was precisely why he needed an intelligent person to help him with this. The blonde said that some stupid prisoner could hardly turn him into an Archduke emperor. Rixit said that she deceives people and lives at their expense, and that the rumors about her reached the prisoner. The prisoner said the rumors weren't true, but the prince didn't care. He believed that it would be she who would place him on the throne. The green-eyed woman had no choice if he didn't help her ascend the throne. She would face the death penalty for her crimes. She promised to carry out His Highness's task, and the prince said that if she succeeded, a reward that would not disappoint her would await her. Rixit promised her enough money for the rest of her life, and if she wanted, she could even obtain a title. The prince promised to come for her at dawn, and she would become his closest strategist, and she would leave with honor. He smiled, looking at the blonde with green eyes, and believed that she would definitely succeed in what he had planned. She looked at him with kind eyes and wondered if he had gone crazy after such an event. The girl believed that the prince was a first-rate fool, and that God had forgotten to set the instructions in his brain. She tried to understand where he got the idea of taking a criminal as his strategist. The criminal didn't understand why she should waste so much time with a man who would never become a ruler. She thought that doing nothing was a good idea, but going to this prison was her conscious decision. The girl took out a fork and, smiling, planned to escape from the prison as soon as possible. The prisoner in her past life, or rather in her past world, had tried almost every activity, but this world was very different. She was an assistant, fund manager, and financial analyst in large companies. But most importantly, she arrived there as a fraudster. Her first plan was to write a fake letter to the university, and she did it simply because she was curious to know what it was like to be a student. The girl did not hesitate to deceive people, not for big reasons, not even for the most insignificant ones. And they started looking for her all over the country. The authorities were very naive and stupid. They couldn't find her, let alone catch her in any way. She used makeup and manipulation, and one day she came into contact with the president of a large company. The girl was very rich, wore designer clothes, and denied herself nothing, but this life quickly became boring for her. She secretly sold the shares in someone else's name and fled, but she made the first mistake of her life. One day, when she was trying to escape silently with her wealth accumulated over the years, she was caught by the shoulder. For a person who is above the law, for example, the president of a company, there is nothing difficult about simply killing a person. And that's how her life as a fraudster ended. And after all that, she opened her eyes and realized she had been reborn in a different place. She was born again, without a silver spoon in the same place, and again decided to take that slippery path. The blonde remembered that she had a conscience and that she only deceived the rich, but she was glad that they left her mind. That is why, even after reincarnation, the girl continued to lead a life of scams and fraud. She had worked in her trade for more than 21 years, and in general, she had no regrets. The world was very different from what it had been in the past, a class society, and similar to the world of Western books. Although there was significant technological progress in this world, real magic existed in it. In the new world, the basic situation among all people was much simpler than in the past. If the poor committed any crime, the only punishment they faced was the death penalty. Sophisticated criminals lived in the bosom of God, and with the help of magic could deceive people. The girl little by little became a famous fraudster, using her knowledge and learning new things. By constantly changing her identity, she began to make a lot of money using her scams. She was among the ranks of especially dangerous criminals, nicknamed the Faceless Criminal. But the locals nicknamed her a brilliant fraudster. The girl wondered if a high-ranking Archduke would simply come to the prison and ask her to become a strategist. She remembered how His Highness came to her cell, full of hope and with serious intentions. The girl wondered if her extraordinary mind could turn this man into a true ruler. She stared at him and understood that it was just curiosity and nothing more. The fraudster was not one to waste time on unimportant things and began to plan her escape. The shift change for the prison guards happened at 7 in the morning, and she had more than an hour at her disposal. She knew that the gallium used in these plates was cheap and had a low melting point. The girl made a key with this material and easily freed herself from the bonds that tied her. She remembered that especially dangerous criminals were kept without a bathroom, and she had to defecate there. That's why in such cells there was a hole in the sewer, locked with a key, through which it was possible to escape. It was at that moment when clean water was supplied to wash away the excrement, and it was necessary to leave on time to avoid suffocation. The girl hoped to be able to escape without problems and to be able to say goodbye to the prison in the morning. She smiled and mentally began to say goodbye to His Highness, wishing him good luck. The dangerous fraudster believed that he would be a very good ruler once seated on his throne. Rixit walked through his castle, accompanied by his subject dressed in a black suit. The butler explained that the fraudster's nickname, Viper, was due to her skill with poison, which gave her great success in her scams. His Highness commented that she was quite insolent, but he liked her vision of the world. He thought of her and remembered what she was like, a smiling blonde with green eyes. In reality, she was a young woman who had just become an adult. His Majesty asked his servant if he was sure that she was really that smart. The butler informed his master that she had been terrorizing the whole area for 4 years straight. He said that if there was enough gold to cover her need for greed, then there was a chance. However, even if it is successful, this insidious woman cannot be trusted. You can trust every person in the world, but not the Viper. Rixid said he was aware of this and asked if the butler played the organ all the time. The butler was simply worried about Rixid's character, who unconditionally turned a blind eye to the person's actions. He continued and remembered some interesting fact about the Viper, but suddenly something stopped him. They, together with the butler, approached the cell where 3 guards were, trying to understand what had happened. Upon seeing His Highness, they began to say his name pitifully, trembling with fear. Rixit, ignoring them, entered the chamber silently and saw that it was completely empty. There were broken shackles on the floor, and the sewer grate was open, and it hadn't even been pushed back. A terrible note was hanging in the cell, and His Highness asked the guards menacingly what had happened there. They were terribly frightened, and, lowering their heads, began to speak in a trembling voice about the Viper. The guards, bowing their heads and hoping for Rixit's mercy, reported that the captive Viper had escaped. The butler watched as the guards apologized to His Highness for letting the prisoner escape. His Majesty ordered his servant to find out in detail from the guards how exactly this happened. Rixit asked the guard angrily if they had stolen the key. The butler asked him not to scare the witnesses. He fell on one knee and saw an object on the floor. It was a master key made with a fork. The butler concluded that with its help, she had managed to get rid of the shackles and escape through the sewers. Rixit began to examine the fork master key and came to the conclusion that she hadn't stolen the keys. The guard watched in horror as His Majesty tried to figure out how the cutlery had gotten there. A magic metal detection device was installed near each entrance, but it didn't work. Rixit asked how Viper had successfully passed the test yesterday, but still escaped. The guard was completely confused due to fear and didn't understand how to tell His Majesty everything correctly. He tried to remember how the meal went. The prisoners sat at the table and ate their food. The Viper passed through the magic scanner, and it didn't detect the slightest presence of metal. Suddenly she blushed, and Viper was scared by what was happening. The guard started asking her what she had taken. He pointed his finger at the dangerous criminal and continued interrogating her after the scanner. The Viper raised her hands and said she couldn't take something knowing for sure that she would be caught. The Viper came to her senses and told the guard that she had remembered something important. She brought her hands to her head, up to her styled hair, and the spoon that held the buns served as a hairpin. The Viper said that her hair was in her way while she was eating, so she tucked it away and then forgot to take the spoon out. The guard saw this and thought it was true, since she would have hidden a fork or a knife. He asked Viper to be more careful next time, and she laughed and waved at him. The guard swore that he had definitely confiscated the spoon from the fraudster, and that she couldn't have stolen it. The butler said the spoon was just a trick, and that, in principle, it couldn't fool the magic detector in any way. He assumed that she had manipulated and hidden the fork somewhere, attaching it to her body. His Majesty, realizing what had happened, started laughing out loud and couldn't even stop. Rixit told the butler that he was right, and that she was really a very good woman for not waiting for her execution. His Majesty became thoughtful, something worried him, and he rubbed his chin. Rixit was tormented by the question of why Viper, who had hidden skillfully for 4 years, was caught in his domains. The jailers fell to their knees with a crash and began to beg for His Majesty's forgiveness. Rixit didn't understand why they were doing that and asked the guards what motivated them. They said that His Majesty's treasure, which was kept in the vault, had mysteriously disappeared. Rixit smiled and asked rhetorically about the ring she had stolen from his vault. It carried a sky-blue mineral that symbolized the noble side of his family. When a member of the family was born, each one was given a crown, a ring, and a bracelet made of elphium. The treasure couldn't be lost, so the family tried to hide it in various ways using magic. The butler put his hand on his forehead and understood why the ring had strangely disappeared a moment ago. The Viper came specifically to Drax and ended up in prison to steal the royal ring. Rixit and the butler exchanged glances because they were thinking the same thing at the same time. The Viper was captured for the sake of the ring and revealed her identity to be able to enter the prison walls. The butler asked if His Majesty had done the right thing by listening to his advice in time. He pulled back his sleeve and said he had done the right thing by installing the magic protection. The butler had brought him a scroll a couple of days ago that contained a spell that would prevent slaves from escaping. This was the principle of the connection between slave and master through poison and blood. As soon as the slave escaped, she would feel terrible pain and return to the master. Rixit said that human relationships are based on trust, and it is unlikely that Viper will trust under such conditions. The butler said it was an amazing sensitivity for someone who takes down 100 heads on the battlefield. The butler understood what Rixit was thinking, but said that, unfortunately, they had no other choice. If you don't use a force spell, the Viper will sooner or later disappear, and that will be the end. Rixit didn't want to do it, but he was lucky to find her again and not miss her this time. He used magic, and the sign on his hand shone a deep red. His Majesty began to wait for the result. The white-haired criminal enjoyed the beauty of the royal ring she stole from the vault. She had already decided where to go next, and it was a kingdom called Eisenbach. The criminal planned to pose as a lost princess, show her ring, and live happily ever after. She thought about how surprised His Majesty was when he realized his precious ring had disappeared. The criminal named Viper suddenly felt a sharp pain and started to run. She fell to the ground and began to suffer strong pain. Tears ran down her green eyes. The rogue was immune to poisons and could not have died from such a dose. She wondered what they had put in her drink that she hadn't noticed. The fraudster Viper didn't understand what kind of poison it was, or why her body was moving on its own. She crawled somewhere, and in front of her, lying on the ground, someone stopped. The rogue raised her head and saw someone's high boots, and the pain she was experiencing stopped. His Majesty found her and asked her where his main advisor, Viper, was going. The criminal lowered her gaze and looked with a sigh at His Majesty, from whom she had stolen the ring. The girl lay at his feet and understood that this time he had outsmarted her, and she was ready to submit. She said he should have suspected her as soon as she turned herself in, but unfortunately he wasn't that smart. They laughed, and His Majesty asked if her target was definitely the precious ring from the vault. The rogue took off the ring and said it was very beautiful and handed it to Rixit. He was sure she hadn't stolen it simply because it was beautiful and demanded to know the real purpose. Rixit took the fraudster's hand and began to place the precious ring on her when he finished. He told her to keep it. The blonde watched as they put the ring on her and didn't understand what was happening. Rixit explained that he would be in a very uncomfortable situation if he lost the royal family's treasure. The girl said she wasn't afraid because she wouldn't lose the ring, and Rixit said that it was now her ring. Then he smiled and said that now she belonged to him and brought a finger to his chest. Rixit said he wasn't cruel and that his heart broke seeing her pain. The girl realized that he had secured himself with poison. He told the girl that she wouldn't have died otherwise. It would have been a significant loss of such an impressive talent. Rixit clenched his white-gloved fist and said he would become emperor, no matter what it cost. The fraudster understood that he wanted to sit on the throne for a reason, because she understood that he had no place on the throne. She was interested in the true reason. He looked into her eyes and asked her to help him with this task, and the girl began to melt. Looking into his eyes, the fraudster grimaced and understood that this was far from a request or a polite offer. The prisoners of this empire had no choice. If they wanted to live, they did what they were told. Rixit offered her his hand and said that revealing her talent by working for him was better than dying executed. He lifted the girl and, looking towards the forest, told her that it was hot today. Shaking herself off, she said it was bearable. The girl continued to look thoughtfully at the ground and shook the dust off her clothes. He lifted her with one hand and began to tell her that he was going to get her out of prison with honor and amnesty. The fraudster was scared, and Rixit continued telling her that if they simply released her, the escape wouldn't be far off. His Majesty decided that the most effective method would be to steal the fraudster himself. His Majesty and the rogue Viper returned to the castle in a horse-drawn carriage. Rixit looked closely at Viper and wondered what kind of person she really was. He understood that everything she said was a lie. Even the face with which she smiled could be makeup. He needed to check her skin. Rixit asked the green-eyed blonde what her real name was. She pretended not to understand the question. He began to list the names by which the rogue had been detected. She was glad that there was so much interest in her person. The Viper was surprised by his knowledge and observed that he was not as distant as they said. Rixit corrected her and said that his butler Owen had told him everything about it. He said he was fed up with evading the question and hoped to hear the criminal's real name. The Viper smiled and told His Majesty that she didn't actually have a real name. She said she had no name and that no one had given her one. Viper had always been alone. Rixit asked if the criminal had parents or someone who raised and educated her. The girl said she didn't remember them at all, but that they were probably there and hadn't fallen from the sky. Rixit wondered if she would have become an imposter if she had been born into a common family. And rich, the Viper said she lived her life using an appropriate mask and that it was difficult to catch her because she had no documents. The girl pretended to be innocent and allowed His Majesty to give her any name he wanted. Rixit asked if she was sure she accepted to help. Viper said she wouldn't be there if that wasn't the case. His Majesty said that anything could be expected from her and that it was most likely that she was now planning to jump out of the carriage. Viper said she had changed her mind about Rixit previously. They had portrayed him as a person who could not be trusted or served. Rixit asked the smiling fraudster what actions had made her change her mind. She pointed out that she didn't expect poison from him and admired his courage and determination at the right moment. The Viper tried to deceive His Majesty and asked him what poison he had given her, but he ignored her. She continued to interrogate Rixit, trying to find out what properties the poison he gave her had. He said that he was not a fool and that he had no intention of explaining it to her, and that a criminal's human rights were not something to worry about, but that he himself had asked for help. His conscience tormented him, and the Viper insisted that His Majesty find her a name. He knew that she had been lucky to have been born as a fraudster, with a sharp mind in an empire where status was important. It would have been very difficult for a beautiful commoner to survive. He raised his hand sharply and informed the criminal that he would definitely deal with this later. His Majesty gently took her cheek and leaned down to her eye level. Viper began to breathe rapidly. He said he didn't expect such a fraudster to turn out to be a true beauty. Rixit embarrassed the rogue Viper when he held her cheeks, and she couldn't say a word to him. She saw what Rixit was trying to do and told him not to try to remove her mask. It was her real face. Viper said that suspicion and caution are the fundamental principles for her survival in the main house. Suddenly, Rixit turned away from his new advisor and asked her what that stench was. The Viper began to rub her shoulders and feel embarrassed. The same stench from the sewer was emanating from her. His Majesty exhaled, and upon perceiving the smell of sewage, said that nothing could be done about it. He ordered the carriage to stop near a shop with a sign of a beautiful woman, and he and Viper went in. There were beautiful dresses and other things in the shop, and Rixit ordered the owner to wrap everything in the shop. He pointed his hand from one end of the room to the other and asked again that it be wrapped up with him. The Viper began to signal for him to leave and told His Majesty that a single dress would be enough for her to be able to change. Rixit didn't understand how she was going to live with only one dress. Was she really going to wash it and wear it again? The Viper said that was exactly how common people wore clothes, and His Highness was very surprised by this. She explained that expensive clothes were worn and washed until they lost their divine appearance. Rixit was clearly confused when he heard this answer and didn't understand how this was happening. He didn't understand what she spent the fraud money on, since she couldn't even buy herself clothes. She started telling me that she spent all her money on the poor children at the orphanage, and that nowadays medicines are not cheap. Rixit listened to the interesting story of the advisor Viper and only sighed. He asked her not to deny herself anything and suggested that at that age girls simply go crazy for dresses. Viper confirmed it, but said that she never dreamed that one day she would find herself in such a situation. She clutched the dress between her small hands and asked if it was true that they would really buy all that for her. Rixit looked at her with his yellow eyes and said that of course he could buy it all. The Viper feigned embarrassment and asked if she could accept such expensive gifts. His Majesty promised to buy her everything she wanted in the future, but for now, he asked her to choose a dress to wear. The Viper pointed to a pink dress displayed in the shop window and asked to try it on. His Majesty called the hostess, and in front of them was an adult woman with her hair up. He pointed his finger at the display case and asked the owner to prepare a dress for her to try on. The hostess approached the guests and handed them a dress, and then pointed with her hand to the place where she could try it on. She told the owner that she had never worn such luxurious dresses and asked for her help. The owner couldn't believe what she was hearing. Rixit watched the situation with attention and realized how uncomfortable his new advisor felt. He asked menacingly what the hostess didn't understand and ordered her to help his companion immediately. The hostess got scared, but understood His Majesty and asked the fraudster to go to the fitting room. Rixit watched attentively as the girls entered the fitting room and didn't relax for a minute. She chose her words carefully, and he couldn't believe that such an unfortunate girl could be the Viper. Rixit was surprised that his blonde advisor was so upset by an ordinary gift. He thought, sitting on the sofa waiting for Viper, Rixit hoped that his gifts would give him loyalty. There was an empty cup in front of him, the tea of which had run out long ago, but the girls were still not in sight. He had never been with girls, so he had no idea how long it took them to make their dresses. Rixit remembered the words that Viper could not be trusted, and that all her words were lies under a mask. And he suspected that something was wrong. He realized that trying on even the most complex dress couldn't take that long. And he opened the doors. The hostess was sitting, tied to a chair, with a knife at her throat, and trembling with fear, looking at His Majesty. Rixit cursed for having been deceived again, and freeing his hostess from her bonds. He began to ask what had happened. The frightened owner, with tears in her eyes, began to explain that she had been tied up. And then the girl ran away. Rixit said that he was no fool either and began to interrogate the woman, who was already scared. He was interested in knowing what she had done. The hostess got even more scared and, stuttering, began to remember and tell what had happened. She remembered how they, together with the Viper, who was carrying the dress in her hands, entered the room. The Viper said that if she had known there was a window there, she would have gone alone. This surprised her owner. The blonde criminal suddenly pulled out a sharp knife and began to threaten the poor hostess. She told the owner that since they were there alone, she should point out the outskirts where there were no people nearby. The hostess explained in detail where to go. Viper skillfully tied her up with a knife at her throat, and putting on a new dress, she escaped. Before leaving, she smiled politely at her tied-up hostess and began to say goodbye. She warned that if the owner moved too much, she would definitely pierce her precious chin. The Viper in the beautiful dress thanked her mistress once again and skillfully jumping out the window. She said goodbye to her. Rixit listened attentively to the account of his hostess, who was sobbing after the terrible events she had experienced. He remembered that if his butler Owen suddenly found out about this incident, he would start lecturing him. Rixit discovered the knife from her prison and realized that Viper had stolen more than just the fork. His Majesty asked the hostess to remind him one more time which street the fraudster had fled down. He knew he must activate his slavery spell, but he was worried about her being alone on the street. Packham was not a very safe place, especially for such beautiful girls. Rixit could not afford to increase the distance between them, otherwise his advisor would get much worse. He made a decision and began to unbutton the sleeves of his shirt to use the spell. When he rolled down his sleeve, he saw that the spell on his hand was glowing deep red, and it was already ready to be used. The barefoot criminal who had escaped from His Majesty was barefoot on the sidewalk and remembered the way. She thought that Rixit was a fool to believe her stupid stories and accused him of falling for her deception. The rogue concluded, based on recent events, that he would be a terrible emperor, and began to look around. Around there were common townspeople with courtesans, as well as all kinds of suspicious characters. She realized she needed to flee this city as quickly as possible so as not to weaken and get into trouble. Suddenly, a huge figure appeared from the shadows that was twice the size of the rogue. The white-haired fraudster realized that that big guy had definitely noticed her and began to follow her. The bull looked at the beauty and asked how such a noble lady like her had ended up there. The viper realized the danger she was in, and if she had known this would happen, she would have dressed more comfortably. She noticed how that rough brute began to stretch his huge, dirty hands toward her. The fraudster dodged him skillfully, and the brute was confused, without immediately understanding what had happened to him. She saw how he began to fall, unable to stand, and apologized to the brute in advance. The rogue knew exactly what she wanted to do to her attacker, and warned him that it would hurt. The green-eyed blonde swung and kicked the huge, rude man in the balls with all her might. The viper suddenly felt that something bad had happened and began to lose strength. Realizing the situation she was in, she fell to her knees in front of the huge beast and continued to lose strength. It was a stalemate situation. The fraudster understood that this had happened to her before and tried to understand what sensations she had experienced. She lay down on the bull's stomach and experienced the same thing she had experienced in the forest. The thug crouched down in front of her and smiled, anticipating how he would take revenge on the vile fraudster. The rogue knew in the shop, when she was interrogating His Majesty, that this could happen to her. She should have checked it herself, since he had been smart enough to refuse to reveal the nature of the poison to her. The bull looked at the blonde who was lying there without strength and thought she was a drug addict and urgently needed a fix. He asked the little rogue if he had guessed correctly as she crawled slowly down the road in her beautiful dress. The blonde realized that she had begun to crawl, moving arms and legs, and her body was paralyzed and did not obey her commands. The bull laughed, dancing with his pelvis, and shouted for his victim to crawl, moving arms and legs. He approached her and whispered to her about what she was taking, because he knew that noble ladies took very potent substances. The thug began to stretch his huge hands toward the girl and said she was different from the cheap ones they usually got. He had practically grabbed our criminal by her snow-white hair and was bringing his hand closer and closer. Suddenly, something saved the fraudster named Viper, and the abuser was hit on the head with something. The blonde watched with her big green eyes as the blood of her attacker spilled. She looked up and noticed that someone was there as the big guy fell backward onto the sidewalk. The huge figure of His Majesty, with evil eyes, asked if his advisor wanted to die. Rixit began to shout at Viper and ask her why she had collapsed on the road. The Viper continued lying awkwardly on the ground and looked at Rixit shouting at her. Everyone around fled upon seeing how Rixit knocked out the man and looked angrily at the girl in the beautiful dress. The Viper calculated that the trip from the studio to this place took 20 minutes and was surprised why she was there. Rixit got angry and, grabbing the brute by the face, lifted him into the air with one hand, which surprised Viper. She looked at the picture and said she knew how it would end and wanted to stop it. Rixit watched as his new advisor with white hair and beautiful green eyes smiled at him. She began to try to justify herself, brushing the dust off her dress with the hand on which she wore that same ring. Rixit watched what was happening and reminded the advisor that he had warned that escaping was impossible. The Viper realized that as long as she wore the ring she could not escape, and asked if he had used the spell. Rixit continued to look menacingly at the rogue and said he was glad that his advisor had understood. The Viper said that the spell had not yet disappeared, and His Majesty confirmed this fact. She thanked him for his efficiency and told him that if he hadn't arrived in time, she would have been in big trouble. Viper said that as soon as she tried to escape and ended up on the street, it was clear that she had no chance. Rixit said that if she now knew for sure that she could not escape, she would not make such stupid mistakes. The blonde asked His Majesty why he looked at her so menacingly and remained silent. He lifted her again with one arm and placed her stomach over his shoulder to make it easier to carry her. The Viper showed her bare feet and His Majesty, hugging her under her knees. He ran to the carriage. Rixit said that her feet would not touch the ground until they reached the palace, and that if she wanted to live, she must behave calmly. The Viper looked back at the unconscious brute and decided that it would be better to hang from his shoulder in silence. Rixit had already kidnapped the blonde fraudster for the second time and had taken her to the castle. Butler Owen opened the doors carefully and saw the scene that was unfolding. He saw how His Majesty was carrying his new advisor Viper on his shoulders, holding her by the legs. Rixit walked silently past his butler, carrying Viper on his shoulder. Butler Owen turned again to his master and asked him why he had arrived so late. Rixit explained that his criminal was like a wild animal and that he had barely managed to catch her. The Viper complained that it was already very bad for her to be hanging upside down because the blood had gone to her head. Rixit put the blonde advisor on the ground, and she immediately grabbed her aching head with her hand. The criminal noticed that the butler was looking at her suspiciously and would not take his eyes off her. The butler put his hand on his chest and announced that he was happy to see the brilliant fraudster Viper in the palace. She was sitting in a huge palace hall, on a beautiful sofa in the presence of the butler and His Majesty. Rixit crossed his arms and ordered his butler to bring the contract. He accepted immediately. He handed the documents to Viper and informed her that she could review the contract herself. The man told the blonde fraudster that he was the butler and that he was responsible for the main affairs of the palace. The butler smiled at the fraudster Viper and told her she could call him Owen. The Viper smiled upon hearing this information and remembered it as a very important fact. She immediately asked the frightened butler if he had come up with the idea for that spell. The butler confirmed her suspicions and said that he simply could not afford to wait and avoid Viper's antics. She realized that he was more than a simple butler because he was good at hiding his emotions, and he was smarter than his master. The Viper took a risk and asked if he would answer her if she asked how to remove that terrible spell. The butler thought about the options and said that if such a solution existed, she herself would have discovered it a long time ago. Owen began to explain that it was an ancient magic based on poisons and created to prevent slaves from escaping. The connection could be broken if someone died. This magic was based on the principle that the master's blood flowed through the slave's body. The butler said that at the moment of the master's death, the blood in the slave's body freezes, which scared His Majesty and the Viper. Rixit got scared hearing this and, grabbing the butler by the chest, demanded he repeat what he had just said. He called Owen a bastard and asked him how he could not have told him in the first place. The Viper, who was watching what was happening, realized that that very unpleasant character had just appeared. She noticed that His Majesty was not exactly the brightest mind and also got angry easily. Viper knew she had to help him, but she didn't understand why he was so furious about the conditions of the spell. She watched him as he scolded the butler and immediately realized that he was not the man people said he was. Owen, in his defense, said that if he had told him, His Majesty would have refused, and he would have made him forget it. He explained that without the spell, Viper would have escaped, and his big plan would have gone down the drain. The butler said that his main task was to ensure the safety of His Majesty's life and the prosperity of the country. Owen felt no danger and simply smiled, knowing he had done the right thing. The butler looked at the Viper and told her the terrible things she had done to other people. The blonde laughed when she heard how some men were beaten to death because of her, and she tried to joke about it. The butler smiled evilly and said that there was no need to be surprised after all. They all deserved to die. They were the founders of a gambling house and did not hesitate to traffic in unfortunate people. The butler adjusted his clothes and explained that all of Viper's victims were involved in some kind of fraud against the law. His Majesty, hearing these terrible things, clenched his fist and said he did not regret that such people died. However, this did not atone for all the sins committed by the Viper after all. She did not do all this with good intentions. The Viper said she chose those for whom she wouldn't have to feel guilty. It is good to live in a happy world, but there is no guarantee that there is a place for everyone. 4 years ago, she was included in the list of people wanted for numerous crimes and sentenced to death. The butler said that His Majesty had given her the opportunity to start living the life of a noble citizen, not of a criminal. Everyone in the palace, including His Majesty, intended to treat her with respect and as an equal. Upon signing the contract, Viper committed to helping the Archduke in all available ways and inaccessible ones. The Viper was worried after all. She had never tried to be a secretary for a ruling person before. The butler asked to read it carefully and was willing to listen to all wishes. For example, regarding the salary. She read it and said she only wanted the costs of any additional services that might arise to be covered, and nothing more. The butler didn't understand when she managed to read it and thought she simply wanted to sign it without looking. The butler and his new advisor turned around because His Majesty called them. He looked angrily at the pair and ordered them to stop chatting and get to work on important matters. Suddenly, the Viper turned to His Majesty and announced that she had just proposed a point she wanted to present. She said that if she fulfilled her obligations, or if suddenly her help was no longer needed, then the obligations would have to be terminated. The Viper stated that she was under the influence of a powerful spell for slaves, and that it was very inhumane. She said that she had known His Majesty for a day, and that she wanted to become a free person after fulfilling her obligations. The guys watched as she applied the ink, and magic runes appeared around her, forming a contract. The contract was signed, stipulating the promise of the lives of Viper and Rixit, and upon its fulfillment, she would be freed. The rogue asked if all members of the royal family had a magic contract, and he was no exception. Rixit chuckled and began to smile, saying that his new advisor was very insightful and knew everything. The butler realized something and started calling his master all over the room to tell him. Rixit ordered him to be quiet and reminded him that he did not dare to object when he took a man's life. The Viper laughed and rejoiced in her soul, calling His Majesty a man of a very good heart. Rixit said that he had not intended to turn her into a slave, but he hoped that everything would turn out very well between them. The Viper said there was no need to worry, and that she was a professional at that, and His Majesty invited her to go with him. They entered a large treasury, filled to the brim with gold and other valuables. He showed her the magic runes and told her that the treasure was protected and that, instead of risking her life, she should turn to him. The Viper looked at him and hit her nose against his hard back, and His Majesty turned around and asked her if she wanted to take something. Rixit said he wasn't joking, and said he felt neither heat nor cold at such an amount of kindness. The Viper exhaled after listening to His Majesty, and said that a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Rixit was stunned when he saw that Viper was already covered in rings and was happily enjoying their beauty. He was surprised to see that a bunch of different jewels kept falling from the Viper. Rixit laughed when he realized what had happened and observed how uncomfortable his new advisor was. They continued standing and admiring the beautiful treasures in the Great Vault. Rixit asked when she had managed to grab so many things, but Viper replied that it was confidential information. His Majesty looked at the fraudster with a smile, then laughed mysteriously and exhaled. They continued advancing through the treasury and saw a pedestal with magic hanging over it. There was a magic contract there. Viper asked him if he really wanted to spend it. Rixit said that, anyway, it was useless. The Viper was surprised that His Majesty was not interested in power or material wealth. The man who had this from birth did not suffer for it, but why did he want the throne? Rixit took the stack of papers signed by the rogue and asked her to come. In front of them was a pedestal with a hollow for papers, over which there was a red magic circle. Rixit took out the ritual dagger in front of Viper and began to tell how the ritual was performed. He explained that the hole had to be filled with the blood of people who had signed a contract with each other. The Viper saw the beautiful stiletto and began to tremble, asking if Rixit had changed his mind about killing her. He said that it was not the murder weapon and that a lot of blood would be needed, and he hoped she was not afraid of scars. The Viper was very surprised to hear this and noted that His Majesty was a very sensitive man. She squeezed Rixit's hand, which was holding the weapon, and asked him if he aspired to become emperor. The Viper began to explain that the war for the throne is the same, and that it cannot be carried out without blood. In sacrifices, she explained that if he was too soft, they would never achieve the desired result. You will have to kill women, children, and even the elderly to achieve your goals. The Viper, putting the knife in his hand, asked him if he intended to do such things. Rixit pushed the blonde with his body, took the weapon, and told her that this was something completely different. He said he would not cower in the battle for the throne, but warned that he did not like his people shedding their blood. Rixit realized that it was not necessary to shed blood in equal proportions, and sacrificed more than half of his own. The Viper saw this manifesto, and opening her mouth making a face, remained hanging there. Watching how the blood dripped, Rixit asked the green-eyed girl to give him her hand carefully. He took her fingers and led her to the contract. He turned her palm up and carefully began to present the dagger, which was covered with His Majesty's blood. Rixit carefully pricked the fraudster's finger, and a drop of blood fell exactly in the right place. His Majesty and the rogue watched as a blue glow appeared around the contract. Everything glowed with white light, the red magic circle disappeared, and the contract began to be signed with magic. Rixit reported that everything was ready, and the rogue was surprised that it cost so much money. And everything was ancient. His Majesty asked if the fraudster now believed him, and if she thought again that he wanted to turn her into a slave. Owen forbade him to trust Viper's word, but something told him he could trust her. The butler was distinguished by his intelligence and wit, and he would not have survived without him. But to believe or not to believe is everyone's choice. Rixit promised to believe, but gave the rogue one last chance to confess all the secrets. She clapped and said, "Oh," which surprised His Majesty, who was looking at her. The Viper laughed and slowly began to peel the fake magical skin off her face. She took off her wig, and a pink-haired girl stood in front of him and asked if she had become even more beautiful. Viper said that she had never managed to make her makeup look better than her appearance. And Rixit asked her if she was even a girl. She asked him if he wanted to check, which embarrassed His Majesty, who blushed with shame. Viper said she hadn't shown her true self since she was 6 years old. Rixit was surprised that she had led that lifestyle since she was 6. She said it was an investment in the future, and that as her face grew, she had to constantly change everything. Rixit asked if that was all, to which she remembered that she had forgotten to take off her contacts, and showed her blue eyes. His Majesty did not believe the words, and began to pull hard on the Viper's cheeks, trying to tighten the skin. In the morning, Viper lay on a soft bed and admired the shiny rings on her fingers. Rixit sat on a chair and asked her if she liked the rings. She said that he should have kidnapped her sooner. She began to ask His Majesty exactly what was required of her, and he promised to tell her after dinner. Someone knocked hard on the door, and Rixit allowed them to enter. A man and a woman were in front of Viper. Both gasped and began to smile when they saw what an interesting girl was standing in front of them. The servants were delighted that their young master had found a girl, and had invited her to the table. The governess hit Rixit on the back, causing him to almost choke on his tea. He began to wipe his chin, and asked if the butler had told them the whole situation. The man decided to introduce himself, and said that he was a chef, and that his name was Marco, and he served his dish to the girl. Blue Eyes looked at the cook, and unable to think of anything interesting, said that she was Viper. Rixit looked closely at the girl, and said that her name was now Rosika. She confirmed that her name is Rosika, but she has no last name, so they better call her that. The cook declared that it was a great honor for him, and the governess also remembered that she needed to introduce herself. She said her name was Masha, and until today she thought the Princess of Eisenbach was the most beautiful. Masha was Rixit's nanny at the Imperial Palace, and after his exile, she also moved with him to Drax. The cook was her son. He also worked at the palace for 3 years, until he decided to move here. Rosika realized why he had called her young master when she was a nanny at the Imperial Palace. Masha said she was surprised when a man who hated women brought her here. The cook confirmed it. They thought His Highness had problems there, since he didn't look at girls. Rixit ordered them to stop. The Viper began to say that if she wasn't interested in girls, and rejected them. His Majesty ordered her not to think about it. The cook asked the girl if she liked the food, and she replied that even a simple egg was incredibly tasty. The girl asked to try the dish they served her, and the governess happily served a rack of lamb. She said that Raven loved this dish, and that he and Rixit loved to eat it together. Viper showed her face for a second, and thought that Rixit and Raven were probably the same age. They were talking about the first applicant to the throne, and the rogue understood that he was the first obstacle. Masha began to cry deeply and talk to herself about how this happened. Rixit saw Masha crying and quickly ordered Marco to deal with the problem. He began to take his mother out of the room and asked Mr. Rixit to call him when they were done. There was an awkward pause between the Viper and His Majesty, and both remained silent, looking at each other. The pink-haired girl asked if they knew a coup was being planned. Rixit. He explained that she was crying for another reason. He asked to finish with this meal first, and then promised to tell everything in detail. Rixit promised to tell her his duties, and started by saying that the emperor had 4 children, and continued the story. He was precisely the 4th of the imperial family's children. The previous emperor did not hesitate to bequeath the throne to his firstborn, Roberto. The Duchess was the 3rd, and married the Duke of Prania, and became the Duchess of Prania. Rixit was the youngest and was born decades later. Viper didn't understand what he was trying to achieve back then. The pink-haired fraudster began to tell him that he would have to remove 2 people, and His Majesty knew it. Rixit heard that Viper suggested eliminating the second one first. She didn't want to kill him, and offered to persuade him. His Majesty said it would be more difficult because he was in the way of trying on the crown. The crown prince was a more difficult problem. He could not refuse and had greater support from the people. Viper thought it was more difficult, and that she would have to invent a murder to get rid of him easily. Rixit said there was no need for that, and began to open the big door for the advisor. They walked through a huge dark room with large burning torches on the sides. The temperature of the room was deliberately lowered, and on the table was a sheet that smelled of formalin. Viper apologized and began to clarify why Rixit had said the prince would not have to be killed. He pulled back the blanket, and the prince lay with his eyes closed and a very serious cut on his neck. Rixit looked at the advisor and said that there was no point in killing him because he was already dead. In the imperial palace, they were inseparable for him, a kind and weak-willed guy. Rixit was the closest. The poor prince had no idea what Rixit was like and visited Drax often. The last time was fatal. The Viper heard His Majesty say he didn't want to miss the opportunity and didn't understand why he lied. The pink-haired fraudster looked closely at the corpse lying there and concluded that it was very similar to Rixit. She asked if a man who had lived outside the law his whole life wouldn't disdain placing an assassin on the throne. Viper, squatting near the corpse, looked with surprise at Rixit, who had asked her the question. He began to approach the blue-eyed rogue and began to ask the girl, who had frozen, if she was afraid of him. Rixit smiled and said that he was kidnapped by a bastard who mercilessly killed his best friend. He apologized and told the new advisor that he had no choice but to leave and asked if she had understood well. Viper looked at Rixit and asked if he was sure he wanted her to be afraid of him. The rogue asked if he himself was afraid that she would actually believe him, which puzzled His Majesty. She said that, whether His Majesty believed it or not, she also lied to him a lot. The pink-haired Viper revealed that she didn't become a criminal to lead a simple life. Viper loved easy money. It only took her 3 minutes to evaluate a person, but she was wrong about one thing. She told His Majesty that he should have said immediately that the matter was far from related to the throne. The pink-haired Viper turned to Rixit and declared that he was looking to take revenge on those who had offended him. His Majesty found the fraudster's words amusing and decided to ask her who he should take revenge on. He began to explain that they would have had to kill him anyway on the way to the throne. And the Viper asked him if he was testing her wit. The pink-haired fraudster said that the client has the right to try to know if the work was worth it. She said she divided people into 3 classes. The first sought rationality always, the second, whose desires suppressed reason if they were well processed, and the inferior ones, who followed their desires. But there was a category that she did not get involved with, even when she was just cheating on the street. It was about kind people who could be fooled in an instant and whom even beggars sat on. She pointed her finger at Rixit and said that it was easy to instill a feeling of guilt in those fools, and that she avoided them. The Viper pointed her finger at His Majesty and said that all this time she had been talking about him, that he was magnanimous by nature. She said that he had given himself away by his treatment of a known criminal who had been sentenced to death. Owen said that Rixit was a noble type of person and that he would never stick a knife in the neck of someone he trusted. The Viper looked at the cook and his mother, His Majesty's nanny, and knew that he would not betray his subjects. His Majesty was very eager to trust others and gave them a chance with his behavior. He begged the fraudster for loyalty. The pink-haired girl demanded that Masha and Marco be killed because the connection could not be revealed to anyone. She said this on purpose to show that he wouldn't be able to raise his hand, and that there was no need to pretend to be strong. She had thought his intention to become emperor was strange, but now she was starting to understand. He had no life aspirations or material values, but the prince's death became a driving force. The prince was one of his men, and now His Majesty was driven by the desire to avenge his beloved. She also told him she knew for a fact that he didn't kill the prince, but other people didn't know that. The heir to the throne was no longer alive apart from the assassin and the inhabitants of the palace. Nobody knew. Somehow the body ended up in Rixit's possession, and Viper thought about it. She assumed that the first thing His Majesty wanted to ask was to deflect suspicion from him. Rixit has always lived a quiet life. The emperor exiled him for fear of the dynasty's reputation, and he worked hard to keep his name intact. However, someone framed him, taking the life of his best friend and making him look like a real murderer. The Viper said that until he was emperor, he was strictly forbidden from even looking toward the gallows. She reminded him that now His Highness's life is also the pink-haired rogue's life. The Viper, standing next to His Majesty, patted him on the back and told him not to worry. She laughed, looking at the confused Rixit, and said that with her, he would never be lost. The pink-haired girl left the bedroom into the hallway, and the butler grabbed her from behind and put a knife to her throat. The Viper realized who had grabbed her, and Owen asked the fraudster how she had gotten into the room. His Majesty opened the doors and was very surprised when he saw this image in front of him. He called the butler an idiot and ordered him to let her go. The butler apologized and said there had been a mistake. His Majesty ran to his advisor and asked if everything was okay with her. She confirmed that everything was fine. Rixit saw that the fraudster was shaking and dropped some sheets of paper with text to the floor. The butler said they couldn't let her get away with it after trying to steal something from the room. His Majesty did not want to listen to Owen's arguments and intended to hit him for this act. Viper said she didn't feel offended by the natural reaction and forgave the local butler. She said that she trained as a hitman and that it was the pretty girls who did their job to perfection. Even the most meticulous paranoids, who slept with a knife under their pillow, were powerless before such women. The Viper was impressed by her background and reported that she was a very unusual person. She apologized for being very surprised to find a beauty who had appeared out of nowhere on the estate. Viper said she should praise him for his sensitivity after all. Rixit's life was now her life too. He told her not to worry and asked her to check her face to verify its authenticity. His Majesty stopped Owen's hand and said the face was real and that he had verified it personally. His Majesty said he had almost ripped her cheeks off and asked if the Viper had any ill will towards them. The pink-haired girl asked why he was interested if he knew there were many people she had deceived along her way. He said this was necessary to save the advisor's life and that he had to kill the offenders in advance. The Viper said that she was a fraud and that only her victims could hold a grudge. His Majesty said that if she told him, he wouldn't touch anyone. Rixit looked closely at the blue-eyed fraudster and asked her if she had ever looked death in the face. He said he realized this when he saw her reaction. Feeling the knife at her throat, an inexperienced person would have reacted differently. The Viper remembered how she was chased in her past life and could not escape, and simply died. The fraudster said that only 4 people knew her, and that all her attackers were no longer walking under that sky. She said that the whole day would not be enough to do her task, and that it was time to start doing it. Rixit asked her to go to her room to deal with the wound damage. Viper said that she herself knew how to deal with them. She asked not to worry about the cut because it was minor and did not pose any threat. The pink-haired fraudster thanked them for their concern and walked away to fulfill her duties. Owen shared that he thought it was a good idea to opt for a fake, since once you see such beauty, you never forget it. Rixit continued to hit the butler and said he had done nothing good and kept talking about beauty. He remembered talking to the prince, who told him that he felt crazy envy of the inhabitants. Rixit wondered if there was any reason to envy people who barely managed to make ends meet. He said that at least these people are free and don't have to worry about other people's opinions their whole lives. The prince continued saying that it was not necessary to observe etiquette or raise the sword against his relatives. He shared that he couldn't sleep without fear, and Rixit immediately began to ask who had threatened the prince. The prince complained to his friend that he was having a very hard time lately. He believed he was doing well lately and enduring the situation, but actually, he said he was barely breathing. Rixit looked at the prince with concern and sympathy for several seconds. He didn't know what to say. He said the prince was spoiled and didn't understand what he was talking about and couldn't spend a day in a commoner's skin. The prince laughed and thanked Rixit for his faith in him and said it was time to leave. Rixit felt better after the meeting. He blamed himself for not being more sensitive than usual that day. He blamed himself for not asking what was bothering him and how he could help. But it was too late for burdens. Raven, unfortunately, was already dead, but in reality, someone had brutally murdered him. Rixit remembered how they played under the tree when they were very small and agile children. Owen remembered that if there was no news from the heir, who had gone on vacation, then worries would begin. The Viper wanted to see Raven's handwriting, so she took several letters from His Majesty's office. The butler warned Rixit about the fraudster and gave him instructions, but he looked at the corpse and didn't listen. The pink-haired girl entered the room and thanked Rosika for her beautiful name and promised to use it. Rixit promised his butler Owen that he wouldn't trust her, but he couldn't do it after she said she wouldn't get lost with her. He thought about the fraudster, and in his head, it was as if half of him had already given up. Rosika entered the room in a beautiful dress and wished everyone present a good morning. She asked the butler not to call her Viper anymore so that no one would hear it accidentally. Owen asked what he should call her then, and His Majesty said she should be called Rosika. The fraudster asked the butler why there were no servants there, and he replied that there were only 4 people on the estate. Rosika explained that it was necessary to hire more than 50 people so that the estate wouldn't look empty. She reflected that each department needed at least 10 people, which stunned the butler. Owen began to explain that so many men weren't needed, and that His Majesty didn't like that. She interrupted him and told him that was exactly what they would do. She ordered to hire a dozen people from the lower nobility and asked for a worthy noble title for her. Rosika said she needed to go out and make connections, but the butler was speechless after hearing this. She ate the berries and smiled at him, and then added that the most important thing was to deflect suspicion from His Majesty. The butler continued to ask why she needed the letters, and Rixit stopped him and told him that he had been chatting nonstop that day. He said that if the butler really wanted to know, he should come to his room after the meal. The rogue reasoned that if she wanted to make a fortune from her work, then she needed to try her best. Owen noticed that the knife had cut not only her skin, but also her feelings, and he asked how much longer he would continue to torment him. Rosika remembered that the butler had told her how he had trained for a long time to become a true contract killer. She noted that he was fast and intelligent, and from their conversations, it was clear he had the gift of gab. And that was wonderful. The pink-haired rogue quickly raised her head to evaluate the local butler's appearance. She began to specify his height, assuming he was 1.80 meters, and asked how much he weighed. Owen replied that he weighed 77 kilos and was happy with his figure, but the fraudster said he needed to lose 3 more. Rosika raised her finger and, looking at the butler, said he could slow down if he wanted to. Owen asked again, scared, what she meant by the word later, after which she looked at the man and said that she wanted him to take all his things off now. Rixit was in a room with candles and many thick, large books. He wondered what kind of den that was and where the books had come from. In such a mess, Rixit was tidying things up and complaining that there wasn't a trace of organization in the room. He looked at the table and saw there the letters his new advisor had recently asked for. Rixit began to carefully examine the letters the rogue had taken and tried to remember what they were about. He remembered how the prince wrote to him about the tulips that had bloomed and about love, and he noted that it wasn't exactly sentimental. The prince shared very personal things with Rixit. He wrote to him that he missed him and told him how much he wanted to tell him. The prince often asked his close friend if everything was okay with him and shared that it was very difficult for him. He was worried that everything was changing and often asked Rixit if he was doing everything right and if his path was the right one. His Majesty read the letter, which was streaked with tears, and thought he had replied. Rixit looked at it and tried to remember if he had ever read it or not. In this letter, the prince said that he was happy and not sad, but that he was very worried because Rixit had been left alone. The letter said that he shouldn't cry for long and that he should be happy because they would see each other again. His Majesty remembered his beloved and how they smiled every time they met. He held the letter with trembling hands and realized he saw Raven's handwriting in front of him. A loud knock was heard at the door, and then Rasika entered and asked in a low voice if she could come in. Rixit saw the rogue and pulled the letter toward himself, as if he was very afraid she would see it. He began to cry and asked the pink-haired fraudster how that could have happened. Rixit asked the bewildered Rasika how that letter had arrived and why he hadn't seen it. He pressed the girl against the wall, holding that same letter in his hands, and asked her to answer his question. Raven entered, and upon seeing this image said that Rasika really had golden hands. She began to push His Majesty away, and said that everything wasn't going according to plan and that she was confused. Raven held the letter in his hands and said he would send it directly to the palace right now. He asked His Highness if he was there, and fearfully, he asked him why he was looking at him so intensely. Rasika looked at the prince and understood that at that moment she had made a serious mistake. Raven realized what had happened and asked Rixit, who was approaching him. If this was surprising, he began to say that he didn't believe it either, and looked in the mirror for a good while. Suddenly, His Majesty ran and began to hug the bewildered prince with a letter in his hand. In reality, he was so naive that he believed the crown prince was no longer dead, and was standing in front of him. Rasika looked at this and understood that, even though she realized it was impossible, he still wanted to believe it was real. She took His Highness by the hand and began to explain to him that this was not the real Crown Prince Raven. The rogue began to slowly remove the makeup, and Rixit began to laugh hysterically. Looking at this image, it wasn't the Crown Prince, but simply his butler Owen. Rixit was confused. He handed the rogue the text he had recently read, and asked her what it was. The fraudster explained that the letter had been written by herself, and that she had trained to mimic handwriting well. She apologized to His Majesty, and claimed she had no malicious intent. Rixit began to understand this, and pressed his hand to his forehead, to at least hold back his emotions a little. He threw the letter to the ground, and began to blame himself for being a fool and believing in that nonsense. The next day he was standing next to the white birch, looking sadly to one side, and smoking a cigarette. The butler told the pink-haired fraudster that he had stopped smoking a long time ago, but that now he had started smoking again. He said that it had been a great blow to His Majesty, and the rogue explained that she had done it to verify the authenticity of the letter. Now she understood how crazy everything was, and she didn't expect it could turn out like that. Rixit and Raven were born the same year in the imperial family and grew up there together. They constantly exchanged letters and were sincere with each other. The prince's mysterious death completely unbalanced him. Furthermore, it happened right on the lands of Drax. Rasika suggested that it was all a trap to accuse His Highness of murdering the heir. Owen said that at first he didn't care who he was or what he was and lost his mind. Rasika watched him smoke and assumed he wasn't very different from that state now either. He only pretended that everything was fine, but in reality, he hadn't recovered from the death of his best friend. Owen asked if the fraudster knew why His Highness was standing under the birch tree. When His Highness arrived in Drax, this was the first gift the Crown Prince brought him, a young birch tree. The butler heard that His Majesty and the prince planted it together. Rasika nervously watched how His Majesty suffered, and perhaps even worried about what she had done. The butler noticed this, and asked with a smile if the fraudster had experienced any remorse. Rasika had never experienced such feelings, no matter the terrible things she had done throughout her life. The rogue decided to go down and approach the smoking Rixit to chat, and find out how he was doing. He threw the cigarette and began to extinguish it with the sole of his shoe. The little rogue said he could have left it there. Rixit said that it was already cold and that she shouldn't have come here in such a light dress. She said she never bothered to apologize properly and asked for forgiveness, saying she had no intention of intimidating him. Rixit said he understood this and was not angry and asked the rogue to return to the warm room. He looked at the fraudster and asked her why she was still there, and if her cold would prevent her from doing her work. Rixit abruptly took off his jacket and ordered Rasika to put it on herself so she wouldn't catch a cold. Rasika wondered what the Crown Prince would think if he were watching them now. When she wrote this letter, the little rogue assumed that the prince would write exactly like this in a letter. She grabbed the cloak between her hands and once again sincerely apologized for having touched a nerve. Rixit smiled and began to look up mysteriously, as if he noticed something near there. He looked at the birch tree that was in front of Rasika, who was holding his cloak, and forgave her, saying it's okay. Rixit squeezed the letter tightly in his hand and said the rogue had done much better. He said that she had never spoken to him, nor had she met him in person, but that she knew his feelings better than he did. Rixit asked if Rosika knew that the crown prince cried when he wrote his last letter. The pink-haired girl looked away with sadness and grabbed Rixit's jacket even tighter in her hands. His Majesty thought for a moment and remembered that he had never answered this letter. And not only to this one. He never tried to hug, understand, or comfort this child. Rosika put on his jacket and asked what the Crown Prince Raven was really like. Rixit thought about this question and tried to remember what his closest friend was like. He was his dear friend, the brother he followed, the man who took care of him. The Crown Prince was very kind and attentive and always took everything very seriously. Rosika said that Raven was a very good boy and that she understood him just from his letters. Rixit's mother died shortly after birth and Raven had Her Royal Highness the Crown Princess. Unlike His Majesty, Raven could hear the voice of his mom and dad, and he envied them. Rixit tried to hide his bitterness, but the child still understood everything, looking at his brother. From the age of 6, he began to call his father His Highness, the Crown Prince, and his mother His Highness, the Crown Princess. Rosika was surprised that he started doing this at the age of 6, and Rixit laughed and said that he probably felt sorry for his unfortunate friend. Raven was also deathly afraid of his father, who was the real emperor at that time. Every time they scolded Rixit, he always came and received the punishment along with him, and often lied about how he had invented it himself. His Majesty had to be patient and study, and Rosika said that studying is not that hard. Rixit remembered this and realized how kind his best friend was. Rixit said he was surprised by the fact that Raven always came to support him when he was down. The Crown Prince was always there for him, so His Majesty never had difficulties. And Rixit did nothing for him, not even when he begged him in the letters he sent him. He reasoned that even when the Crown Prince died, no one knew of his death. Tears ran down his eyes, and he asked the fraudster if she knew what he regretted most in the world. He thought it would be worth taking the blame after all. Raven wouldn't condemn anyone, not even for his own murder. The Crown Prince is exactly that kind of person. He surely would have said the same thing Rosika wrote in her letter. Rixit said that a person like her would definitely help Raven on his difficult path. His Majesty was sure that she supported him and comforted him in that hour, so terrible for him. Rixit was suffering. He said he was going crazy and assumed he looked like a complete idiot now. Rosika said she saw that dust was getting into His Majesty's eyes and tried to comfort him by wiping away his tears. She said he was right and thought that the Crown Prince, then and now, only wished happiness for his friend. Rosika said that one shouldn't obsess over revenge. Raven wouldn't want his brother to become a criminal. She continued wiping His Majesty's eyes and promised to fulfill Raven's last wish. Rosika reported that the Crown Prince's last wish was for Rixit to be happy. The pink-haired girl looked His Majesty in the eyes with her blue eyes and asked him how she could make him happy. She said that whatever the choice, whether it was revenge or the dead man's will, in which Rixit would be emperor, she would carry it out. She smiled and said that His Majesty had brought her there precisely for that purpose. She opened her arms and said that with her, all his wishes would definitely come true. Rosika was surprised when she was given the title of princess, being first in line to inherit Drax. Rixit began to explain that initially that title should have corresponded to a daughter or sister, but it was him who decided. The rogue began to refuse. His Majesty did this because he knew she would deceive people again as a fraud. Rosika was indignant and explained that this was because a man who spent all his time on the battlefield suddenly had an heir. Owen said that if they gave the title to a commoner, that would raise even more questions for Rixit. But making a woman an heir is exactly in the spirit of His Highness the Archduke. The local butler also remembered that the gentleman was not interested in marriage, and even found it repulsive. Everyone will think it was a sensible choice for a gentleman who didn't like anyone bothering him. A woman suddenly placed in this title will be perceived as filling the empty space beside him. The appearance of a successor was precisely what suited the stupid Archduke, who didn't like to bother. The fraudster and the butler raised their fingers, and the girl commented that the butler was very intelligent. He explained to Rosika that her status as an heir would give her the opportunity to express her opinions without attracting unnecessary attention. Rixit said that there was no need to worry about that, and that, after becoming emperor, he would erase her from the family register. The fraudster decided that it was a wonderful offer, and that there was nothing better than the place of the fake princess. Rosika was once again delighted with this idea and decided to sign the papers that granted her that title. She turned to His Majesty and asked him if her dad would protect her, and he jumped in surprise. Rixit yelled that he was not her father and that Rosika didn't understand why she had decided to call him that. She said that she had indeed gone too far and that the difference was only 4 years, and called him brother, which embarrassed him even more. Rosika looked at His Majesty and didn't understand why she didn't like this either, and he continued to be embarrassed. His Majesty looked closely at the board, on which the White Kintiza plan was written. It was stated that Rixit van Hexen was third in the line of succession to the throne, and the main political circles were absent. The information said that he had a brain made of muscles, he was stupid and very good at fighting. Rosika began to nervously erase the words on the board that indicated the possibility of His Majesty being a eunuch. She decided to quickly change the subject and asked His Majesty if the butler had sent the letter to the palace. Rixit explained that after receiving the letter, people from the emperor's palace would arrive here in about 2 months. He explained that although she would be the heir in words, they could not hide the princess's appearance from society. Rosika finished erasing her notes and asked His Majesty why he was not interested in women. He asked her why she wanted that, and the little rascal said that marriage was an important tool in politics. His Majesty thought for a moment and replied that there was no serious reason for it. Rosika thought everything was suspicious, but Rixit said it was true and that he was hiding nothing. Aristocrats married young for many reasons, whether to revive a dynasty or for political reasons. Even when they found true love, they were in no hurry to marry, but had love affairs on the side. Rosika was tormented by the question of why the crown prince hadn't married yet and remained single. Apparently, there was a girl who was not suitable to be a princess, and such a noble man could not abandon her. Rosika, thinking about this, assumed that Rixit suffered from the same problem, and that was why he hadn't married yet. She assumed that his name had come to her mind for some reason, and asked him to tell her about Rosika. His Majesty was paralyzed and began to think of the best way to answer this question. The Viper asked if His Majesty had a beloved whose name was Rosika. Rixit replied that it wasn't like that, and decided to give his future daughter exactly that name. Rosika pointed out that she was not against getting married, as she had already thought of a name for her future daughter. She decided that the empty bride's place must be filled and asked Rixit to organize a luxurious banquet. Rosika decided she would play the role of a girl, enjoying a luxurious life. Aristocrats alone would be too few and boring, and she wanted to invite the king, the queen, and the princess. His Majesty asked her if she wanted to invite the king himself and Queen Lavita to the reception. He explained that that was not the best idea, as they were barbarians and had no proper manners at all. Rosika tried to trap him by telling him he wouldn't be able to defeat the king, but he replied that he could handle them even with his left hand. She praised His Majesty, calling him a true ideal and a dream man. That is why Rixit defended the kingdom from incursions by small kingdoms waiting for the right moment. Among them, the most powerful was Vita. Its support was what was needed now. Rixit said he had never seen them, but these savages were very rude people and unceremonious. Rosika laughed out loud and informed His Majesty that he would definitely survive this. Rixit asked that they make sure to tell him if anyone offended her and that he couldn't watch her for a whole day. The rogue raised her nose as a sign of importance, but still kept an eye on His Majesty. She noticed that when he was worried, he looked like a big mother bird protecting her chicks. Rosika and Rixit looked closely at the board with notes again, and the girl suggested they start. At last, people who were creating life on the estate appeared in His Majesty's domains. Rosika was happy that people were walking around the estate, but Rixit said he couldn't do it. The girl said that he could do anything, that it was the first time he was organizing a banquet, but that he had no manners, and that he definitely needed to learn. Rixit hysterically grabbed the paper in his hands and asked why the fraudster had taken him for a fool. He called the butler a donkey for asking him how the lesson had gone, proving even more that he was not prepared. Rosika handed the papers to the butler Owen and asked him to show her how to do it correctly. He got very close to the girl and asked her if her parents were thieves, which embarrassed Rosika. The butler continued to act according to the plan and reported that her eyes were like stars stolen from the sky. Rosika melted after those warm words and could only utter the phrase, "Oh my God." Rixit became furious and overturned the table, saying he would never stoop to such nonsense. He tried to read the subtitles and started asking angrily, "Are your parents by chance bakers? Where did they get such sweet bread?" Rixit continued to practice, but he did it so brusquely that it looked like a crowd of knights singing an anthem. He didn't understand why Rasika was teaching him phrases. She told him he would have to learn to flirt. Rixit said she had revealed her motives and asked her who he would need to seduce. Rasika said this was the Princess of Vita, and so that he could become emperor. This was necessary. The fraudster dropped her cup onto the saucer when she heard His Majesty reject her. She hit the table and asked if the student Rixit had thought his answer through well. She realized that a new successor was needed, and that Rasika offered to take the small kingdom to ascend the throne. Rixit's conscience did not allow him to marry a princess he did not love and condemn her to suffering. Rasika did not understand his motives. She asked His Majesty for forgiveness and reminded him that in the fight for the throne, rulers married for political purposes. Rixit remembered how his friend Raven also suffered this stress and other wedding matters. The rogue said that if he wanted to change all this in a year, then they had no other choice. If Rixit was not ready to fulfill his friend's will and give up, then he should have done it here. And now, the day of the Vita Kingdom reception had arrived, and since we were the only ones, it was necessary to make the best reception. It was a great honor for the King of Vita to receive an invitation from the ruler of Drax himself. Rasika thought about it again. She put a finger to her temple and announced that the game had already begun. She apologized to Rixit for having to go against his wishes and asked him to relax. His Majesty was dressed in an elegant suit and tie and apologized for behaving like a child. Rasika asked His Majesty to practice one more time before the royal family appeared. Rixit looked into the distance and thought about what beautiful thing he could say to his advisor. She noticed how he smoothed his hair and began to think of the right words to flirt. Rasika looked closely into His Majesty's eyes and noticed that his face was worthy of contemplation. Rixit noticed the way the little rogue was looking at him. He approached and called her loudly by her name, and asked the blushing girl harshly if by chance her father was a thief, which bewildered the fraudster. She laughed and blushed and told her master that he had completely lost his mind. The girl asked him to speak more naturally, and he took her by the chin, and he began to look into her eyes. He continued to look tenderly into her eyes and began to tell the little rascal beautiful words about the stars. Rixit held his chin and tried to think of something nice to say about the word stars, and seeing how beautifully the fraudster's eyes shone, he said that they truly shone like stars. Rasika was surprised when she heard this and saw that His Majesty froze after these words. Suddenly, Rixit realized what was happening, and scared, he moved away from the pink-haired girl, and he began to tell her, in an awkward and clownish tone, that her parents had stolen her as if she were a star from the sky. Rasika looked at this scene in silence and was very confused after what happened to her. When she walked away, she raised her hands, laughed, and informed His Majesty that it was quite bearable. She said she didn't know what was in store for them, and advised them to remember the phrase well and use it. Rixit asked if it was enough, and if he did a good job using it. His Majesty exhaled and told the rogue that he himself didn't expect to be able to do something like that. Rasika realized that he never said the last line, and it would be appropriate to point this out to him. She remembered the image of him extending his hand towards her and telling her tenderly about the stars with his loving eyes. The rogue held back her emotions and began to walk away shyly to meet the king. The fraudster remembered that at that moment, all thoughts flew out of her head, and she didn't say a word. The King of Vita, upon arriving, thanked His Majesty from the heart for inviting them to his home. Rixit thanked them for coming to Drax and hoped to establish friendly relations with them. His Highness the Archduke began shaking hands, and the king noticed something unusual behind him. The heroine of the occasion was the pink-haired princess, who looked at the king with curiosity. She came to her senses, greeted the arriving king, and bowed, lifting her dress. The king was very happy to see the princess, and began to say that he was very glad to meet her. Rixit looked at the size of the king and the rogue, and thought that if he sneezed, she would fall over. The King of Vita, upon meeting the princess, told her that he had brought gifts, and hoped they would be to her liking. Rasika said it was an honor for her to meet the king and the wonderful gifts he brought. She continued by saying that she had read the history of Vita, and that she was very worried that they wouldn't come. The king was pleasantly surprised that the princess had read the history of the founding of the state of Vita. He said that even his own people didn't like to read it, and that attention to history was worthy of respect. Rasika said she was delighted and that the history of Vita, the first one, particularly impressed her. The king felt uncomfortable when the little rogue began to list quotes from their history books and looked at her with surprise. He was surprised that a girl from such a noble imperial family read books about the history of the barbarians. The king was interested in knowing if His Highness, the Archduke, had read books about the history of Vita and the barbarians. Rasika said that there had always been a special connection between Vita and Drax, and he personally obtained these books. Rixit was confused, but Rasika took him by the shoulder and asked him to confirm this fact. She persistently shook His Highness so he wouldn't do anything stupid, and confirmed this interesting fact. The king laughed and said he felt very honored that they had been invited to Drax. The queen saw Rasika and said that she was polite and beautiful and that her daughter should learn manners from her. Rixit noted that she knew how to win people over and had a special approach for each person. The princess, upon seeing the little rogue so active, was surprised that she was very small and called her baby. A tall girl, with long gray hair, asked if all the girls in the kingdom were that short. Roxas didn't like this. She thought it was rude and shouldn't have been said at the first meeting. His Majesty worried in vain, because the girls found common ground and communicated with each other with great joy. Rasika said that when the princess entered the castle, she couldn't take her eyes off her. She was so impressive. She admitted that she imagined the princess shooting a bow on the battlefield, and her heart sank. Rasika became shy and asked if it wasn't too much trouble for the princess. Could she teach her to shoot a bow? She put on a sad face and said that she wasn't even worthy of being on par with Princess Lavita. The princess happily announced that she would be delighted to teach the fraudster archery. Rixit was surprised at the skill with which the fraudster communicated with people, and said to himself that she was a real snake. She pretended to be an aristocrat of the empire, and at the same time admired the barbarians, and chose her words carefully. The fraudster subtly tried to win the favor of everyone with whom she held any conversation. They were already hugging the princess like old friends and continued chatting about archery. Rasika moved away and began to apologize to the princess, saying that she had completely forgotten about decency. The princess skillfully grabbed the pink-haired girl's hand and began holding her by her small fingers. She put her hand back on her shoulder and told her she shouldn't worry about something so small. Rasika hugged her by the shoulder and said she looked more like a queen than a princess. The princess was very surprised when the fraudster said she should be queen. They began to laugh and Rasika apologized, saying that was rude towards the king and the queen. The royal family continued laughing and said they certainly weren't worried about such things. Rasika was glad to hear this and added that being tall is wonderful and that she herself would like to be a little taller. The princess said that her small stature surprised her a lot and that the little rogue reminded her a lot of a fairy from a fairy tale. Everything was going according to plan, but when Rixit saw what was happening, it really irritated him. He crossed his arms and said that if she had done a good job on her own, then she should have seduced the princess. Someone ordered the princess to move and tightly grabbed Her Highness's hand to push her. She watched as a man walked in front of her. This enraged the princess and gritted her teeth. It was Prince Haram, first in line to the throne, and he welcomed our fraudster. There was an awkward pause, and Rasika looked at Prince Lavita, who was smiling at her with an unfriendly expression. He said the empire was full of beauties, and the fraudster, smiling skillfully at him, thanked him for the compliment. The prince began to raise his hand and said he was glad to see the little beauty after all those skinny guys surrounding him. Suddenly, Rixit appeared between the prince and the advisor and began to block the prince's path. The royal family of Vita witnessed the event when Rixit defended his human. He gritted his teeth and told the prince that a simple handshake would have sufficed. The prince thanked the Archduke for the invitation and said they hadn't seen each other since the last uprising. He said it was rude to speak about a woman in that way, especially when they weren't on the battlefield, and one didn't speak to a lady in that way. Rixit said it wouldn't bother him too much if the prince refrained from being rude in his conversation with the girl. He scratched his head, smiled, apologized for his behavior, and promised to be more careful. The prince remembered that he should behave like a decent imperial citizen from the moment he crossed the border. He told Rixit they were of the same blood, and that he seemed more like a fellow barbarian than an imperial citizen. The prince offered to tell how His Majesty managed to suppress the rebellion, and said everyone would like it. He recounted with what cruelty he treated the rebels, and felt happy when he spoke about it. The princess got angry seeing this, and cursed him for not being able to keep his mouth shut. She pushed the prince sharply from behind and ordered him to pay attention to what he was saying. The princess began to apologize for her brother and to say that he still had much to learn. Rixit said he understood everything because he had spent more than one day on the same battlefield as the prince. The prince heard this and said there was no need for such seriousness, but the king severely stopped his actions. Jaren continued behaving like a child and didn't want to listen to any instructions, but did the opposite. Rixit informed the rogue that the greeting had dragged on too long and suggested ending it there. He smiled maliciously and, laughing, wished his guests a pleasant stay. Rasika began to pull on his clothes without anyone noticing and whispered to get his attention, calling him Your Majesty. Rixit turned and saw the advisor looking at him with disgust in her blue eyes. The butler was in the Viper's room and told her how well he had done. She was happy. Rixit was also in the room and asked the little rogue if she was very scared. At first, she didn't understand what he meant. His Majesty remembered how Prince Lavita had said something about flaying the skin and had raised his hands. Rixit said that he indeed helped with the rebellion, but didn't do the terrible things the prince spoke of. Lavita had the right to command the rebel army, and this prince was at the head of the troops. She smiled and said that Prince Haram was capable of hurting His Majesty's feelings with just one word. Rixit justified himself by saying that he had no penchant for scalping living people. Rasika said that she didn't participate in those events and that she had no idea what was really happening there. The butler and the rogue began to actively talk about how powerful Rixit was and the brutality with which he attacked his enemies. She told him that she knew from others with what skill he cut off heads and how strong others considered him. Rixit got nervous and said he wasn't that ruthless and that he had had his doubts. Rasika and the butler continued laughing, watching how His Majesty clumsily made excuses to them. The rogue shared a comment that Prince Heron had worried her with his behavior and actions. She was scared by his brazenness, although she knew that barbarians weren't really very polite. Rixit reported that he had boasted enormously about his barbarian heritage, although it had long since been a relic of the past. Rasika thought about this and began to worry that such a person could become a ruler. The current king of Vita was very afraid that his heir could turn out like that. She knew the other heirs had been murdered and only the prince remained, and the princess of Vita. Rixit confirmed it and explained that the king was very protective of his image and didn't forgive anyone who destroyed it. The king personally slit the throats of those who didn't follow his rules and damaged the image of the kingdom of La Vita. The fraudster scratched her pink hair and suggested a total change of strategy. Rixit was delighted and asked about the fact that then he wouldn't have to seduce Princess Lavita. Rasika put her hands on her hips and said he needed to do his best to win her heart. It was precisely because their plans had changed that he needed to put all his efforts in that direction. Rasika pushed His Majesty with both hands and forced him to go out for a walk with the princess. His Majesty tried with all his might to avoid it, but Rasika forced him to do it. He was afraid of this and asked for time to mentally prepare for this terrible event that awaited him. The butler and Rasika sat among the bushes to watch how his walk with the princess went. As soon as they saw the princess and His Majesty walking, they began to actively hide among the bushes. The beautifully dressed Archduke walked next to the tall and beautiful Princess Lavita. The princess laughed and smiled after the stories His Highness shared with her. Rasika watched with her mouth open, and the butler commented that they looked quite good together. The rogue stared at this, probably thinking about her previous conversation with Rixit in private. She crouched down and confirmed the butler's words that they looked good together. Rasika remembered how Rixit asked her to come up with a strategy, and she said the main thing was that the prince not rule Vita. She explained to His Majesty that if the prince fell in his father's eyes, he could hardly restore his reputation. Rasika began to smile and told Rixit that she had a very interesting idea. The princess turned to His Majesty and reminded him that he planned to give her something. She watched him as he rummaged for something in his pocket, waiting to see what Rixit wanted to give her. The princess was very surprised when he took out the item he had prepared especially for her. It was a necklace-shaped ornament, golden in color and with stones, and it was called the Queen's Smile. It was the national treasure of Vita, obtained after the suppression of the rebellion. The princess asked him if he wanted to return it. His Highness the Archduke began to feel nervous and shy, and couldn't utter what he wanted to say. The pink-haired fraudster explained to him that he needed to give her this gift and asked him to hang it around her neck. Rixit confirmed the princess's words and, holding out his hand, said that he had delivered it to His Majesty. She said she didn't expect to get it back and that her father would be very happy. Rixit got nervous, and from the bushes, the rogue and the butler suggested he say a different phrase. He turned and shyly called the princess. She responded to Rixit's words with pleasure. His Majesty asked if the princess's father was a thief. Such a strange question. It almost left her with her mouth open. She understood where it was all heading, laughed, and said that he was a thief, and waited to hear what His Majesty would say next. The Archduke began to mumble and get embarrassed, and the princess continued to ask why her father was a thief. Rixit remembered how he had acted towards the pink-haired fraudster when he was practicing his pickup lines. Upon seeing the princess, he got shy and foolishly said that her father had created that impression. She looked at His Majesty again, as if he were an idiot, and asked if he had completely lost his mind. The princess went over it again in her head and thought it would have been fine if it had happened only once. But this little organ kept spinning. Rixit was sitting at the same table with the princess during dinner and began to say that she was like a flower, and she listened with bated breath. And then he said that she had eaten a lot and that he had never seen a person with such an appetite. And again, he offended the princess. The princess clenched her fist with all her might and thought that His Majesty had gone completely crazy. Someone grabbed her by the arm and called her by her name, distracting her completely from what was making her angry. It was the pink-haired rogue, who asked if it was really Rixit who had ruined everything at dinner. She began to say that His Majesty was very inept in such matters and made mistakes. The princess thanked the rogue for her concern and showed her how to correctly tighten the bowstring. Rasika took a stance and aimed an arrow at the target, and the princess praised her for her skills. The rogue thanked her and, handing her her bow, asked her to show her how to shoot correctly. Rasika watched attentively as the princess took the bow in her hands to teach her to shoot. The rogue asked if it was true that the princess was at odds with the Prince of Vita. Harem, Rasika listened while the princess talked about her tense relationship with the prince, and said he did everything in defiance. The princess hit the target with one shot, and Rasika wanted to repeat the same. But the girl explained to her that it would be difficult. The princess said she wanted to participate in the suppression of the rebels that was discussed today. She explained that the rebellion was, of course, a crime, but that one couldn't become an aristocrat overnight if they had spent their whole life eating from the fire. The princess believed that it was the rulers who were responsible for the gradual edification of their people. Rasika said she agreed with the princess's opinion and would like her to become the heir. The princess said that Rasika was simply dreaming and that the matter was not simple at all. Not everything came down to a desire for power. She said that Harem had the right to sit on the throne by birthright, and it didn't matter if he was fit or not. Rasika said that not even the empire, with its glorious intellectuality, was saved from the revolution. She remembered history and said it was the 8th son who succeeded the founder and ascended the throne. It was Hexen II who overthrew his brothers and took the throne, who led our country to its dawn. Rasika said that if they didn't deserve it, then it would be better for the whole family to go voluntarily to the chopping block. The current heir, Prince Harem, didn't inspire any hope, but was simply a dangerous target in a political game. Bo, Rasika smiled mischievously and asked if the princess would hit the target this time, or more precisely, in the center of the target. The rogue shot and hit the target and told the surprised princess that she had expected a worthy ruler. She pulled the bowstring, aimed precisely at the target, and skillfully shot straight into the center of the target. The princess was very surprised to see how the arrow cut the previous one with a precise hit. The pink-haired rogue grabbed the princess's hands and thanked her for teaching her archery. Rasika took the princess by the hand and told her she would become a wonderful ruler. The rogue remembered that the training with her boss from her past life had been very useful to her. She thanked the princess for the good time and asked her to reflect on the conversation. The princess was only second in succession to the throne, but was very patriotic and more suitable for that role than her brother. The only thing she lacked was desire, but seeds planted in time always bore fruit. Rixit needed a reliable partner, so it was necessary to create a situation in which Heron would be expelled. Rasika slapped her cheek and wondered if they should have started with a provocation. A uniformed maid ran past her, with tears on her cheeks, and then left the room like a bullet. She trembled and was very afraid when she saw Princess Rasika in front of her. The rogue looked at the desperate, uniformed girl, and somehow a plan formed in her head. The prince himself, Vita Haram, appeared in the room and called the maid a crazy bitch. The prince saw the pink-haired fraudster and was surprised, for he didn't expect anyone to hear him insulting the maid. Rasika looked at the crying maid and asked her what terrible thing had happened to her. She couldn't tell what happened because she was trained to serve the guests of Vita. The maid was afraid of making the situation worse and told the rogue that nothing terrible had happened. Rasika understood the maid and said she could leave and that the rogue would handle it herself. The maid was very surprised when she heard that Rasika was letting her go and wanted to decide everything herself. She reminded her that nothing had happened and asked how the maid could have mistreated the prince. The prince said she was very good at serving, and Rasika promised she would handle her training. The pink-haired fraudster let go of the scolded maid, who looked at her with pitiful eyes. She said that she and the prince had a lot to discuss in private. The maid didn't want to leave them alone, and grabbing her by her clothes, begged her to go with her. Rasika said she didn't expect such a result from the maid, and asked what her name was. She said her name was Layla, and asked to call Her Highness to talk to the prince. Rasika asked the maid Layla to be silent and listen to what her new princess was telling her. The rogue said that if nothing was happening in the room, then there was no need to worry unnecessarily. She asked the maid to leave as quickly as possible and announced out loud that she had been waiting for her to leave. The prince asked what kind of important conversation it was that made it necessary to come to his chambers and even send a maid. She said that if he were intelligent, he would understand, and said she was tired of being friendly with him. The Prince of Vita was startled and didn't understand what the local princess had said, and thought he had imagined it. Rasika said it was his fault for being deaf, and that she didn't want to bother repeating it twice. He laughed maliciously, looked at the rogue with a smile, and asked if she had gone crazy. He said there was no place for brainless idiots who thought with their head on the royal throne. The prince got angry and said she wouldn't get away with such words, and that he wouldn't tolerate such insolence. He thought that Rixit kept everything. He did hear a secret, and the little rogue asked where he was then. Rasika said that he could have told her everything, but they would hardly believe that a girl like her could have said such a thing. The prince did not calm down and continued to get angry, resorting to obscene language. Rasika began to caress his cheek and tell him that if he had arrived as a guest, then he should behave politely. She ordered him to accept her beauty and kneel before her as a sign of respect. The prince could not stand such pressure, and, calling her obscenely, began to wave his palm with all his might. Rixit appeared between them and asked if the bastard wanted to die doing such a thing. Rasika said she was sorry and that she wanted this ridiculous prince to hit her. His Majesty took the prince's hand and told him he should have shut his mouth at the door when they met. The prince withdrew his hand and said she was the one who started using her hands first, even though she was 2 heads shorter. He began to say that he was the crown prince of Vita and that he would soon become #1 in the kingdom. The prince began to explain the situation and blamed everything on our pink-haired rogue. Calling her a fox, Rasika began to justify herself to His Highness and said that she would never have dared to do such a thing. Rixit said that if she didn't like the prince, she could hit him as much as she wanted. He said the prince would have to expose himself meekly and take the blows. The prince was shocked by these words and observed what was happening with a distant expression, and silent, containing his emotions. He asked with a smile if they really believed the prince would keep his mouth shut after that. His Majesty turned to the prince and proposed making a bet that he wouldn't talk. He put his hand under the cloth and began to tell the prince that the dead were not very talkative. The heir to the Vita throne was scared, and the pink-haired girl asked His Majesty not to touch him. She said he was flirting with the maid and that she just wanted to put him in his place. And maybe she crossed the line. The prince called her insolent and began to tell her that that is precisely what women were created for by nature. He pointed at Rixit and said that experienced warriors like him knew for sure that this was the case. Rixit hissed, gritted his teeth, and became very angry at the words spoken by the Prince of Vita. The prince began to say that during the uprising in Barak, His Highness had sent him more than one girl. He didn't realize he had touched the girl. Rixit couldn't bear those rude words, grabbed the prince by the chest, and hit him in the face with all his might. Rasika, seeing this, covered her face with her hands and was very scared when His Majesty hit the prince. The prince covered his mouth with his hands, which was dripping with blood, after Rixit hit him in the face. His Majesty took out a knife and asked him to continue his conversation so he could make him smile from ear to ear. He looked angrily at the prince and waited for an answer, while continuing to hold back and pressing his hands against his face. The prince was in shock, and the pink-haired rogue asked His Majesty to stop. He covered his mouth with his hands, from which blood was still dripping, and kept looking at Rixit. When he removed his hands, his two front teeth simply fell out and started to fall. He looked in horror at Rixit and the rogue who was holding him, who looked at him in horror. His Majesty showed his knife again and reported that he had told how they had flayed the skin. He ordered the prince to rack his brains and remember if he had really touched anyone with his finger. Rixit ordered him to tell what he did with the girls the prince sent him, and promised to cut his mouth if he didn't say it. Rasika, looking at the situation, wondered how everything had come to this. She reported that not all matters could be resolved with stabbing, and urged His Majesty to stop. The prince accused Rixit of not being able to eat properly, which made His Majesty even angrier. Treating the girl like a thing in front of the rogue was not only rude, but also showed his narrow-mindedness. The prince looked at the rogue, as if she were crazy and really didn't understand why she was talking like that. The pink-haired girl approached the prince and asked him quietly in his ear if he even knew how to use a friend. She said that she had learned one truth in life, that all idiots had one thing in common. The pink-haired girl pointed with her finger at his stomach and said that those people have nothing in their pants, and that, most likely, this is their self-defense. She began to wonder why those men behaved in that way, and suggested it was because they couldn't satisfy a woman. The pink-haired girl turned to Rixit and told him that, apparently, the Prince of Vita was a true eunuch. She asked if he could prove it. She ran away from the prince and, grabbing His Majesty's hand, began to yell that the prince was a pervert. Rixit asked her what she was thinking when she suggested such a thing, and the prince said that she had started it. The pink-haired girl laughed and, looking at him, said that, apparently, there was some truth to his words. She never imagined that the successor of Vita would have such a poor situation with his farm. Rasika was thinking about what interesting things she could tell the imperial aristocrats. And now she had a topic. Rumors of impotence, whether true or not, were rat poison for a man who had a right to the throne. The pink-haired rogue smiled and offered the Prince of Vita to make a bet with her. She bet that there was nothing in his pants, and if the prince proved that everything was in its place, she would even kneel. The prince said she would see, and she would still be at his feet and doing what he said. And suddenly he stopped, looking at Rixit. Rasika laughed and said it wouldn't be her who would kneel, but His Majesty in person. She continued and said that if this were not enough, she would renounce her title of heir. Rasika watched and wondered what he would say, because the situation didn't look very good. His Majesty looked at the rogue, and nodding, said he agreed with her decision. Rasika didn't expect His Majesty to agree, and looking at the prince, she began to feel a little nervous. He said he agreed with the conditions, and that it would be revealed in 2 days when the nobles arrived to serve as witnesses. The prince began to laugh and told her not to come with scissors and other jokes. Rasika said everything was still valid. Rixit skillfully removed the magic ring from the pink-haired rogue's finger and began to put it on himself. Rasika, upon seeing this, began to get nervous and shouted that she had forbidden His Highness from doing that stupidity. Having completely placed the magic on his finger, he began to utter the words Vodicus Hexagorth. The treasure of the Hexen family, the Elfio stone, was not only a beautiful jewel, but also a true magic stone. The shackles symbolize the blue blood of the dynasty and also strengthen the ruler's power. That dominates everyone. Rixit van Hexen, 17th descendant of the great imperial Hexen family, called the guardian of the sanctuary. The ring now functioned as a voice recorder and recorded all the words, so there was no turning back. He made a bet with Prince Haram if he was a eunuch. The victory would be his and, if not, the prince's. The pink-haired girl bowed her head and covered it with her hands, because for her, it was a kind of embarrassment. Rixit informed the ring that he would not change the conditions in any way, nor influence his presence in his pants. If the prince wins the bet, Rixit will kneel and hand over his title of heir to the prince. He said Vordicus Hexagorth again in front of the prince, and the red light of the magic ring went out. Rixit extended his hand into the air, and the ring began to whistle magically. Rasika whispered to him if His Majesty had gone crazy, but he explained that otherwise they wouldn't have believed him. The prince was very happy with this, and asked why Princess Rasika had suddenly turned pale. The oath made to the ring was sent to the guardians, and said oath had to be fulfilled under any circumstances. After taking the oath, the heirs had to appear personally before the custodian and demonstrate before witnesses that his word had been fulfilled. The big problem was that a family member with a red elf was automatically excluded from the line of succession. Rosika reported that now, until the ring returned to its blue color, the path to the throne was closed. The toothless prince waved his hand and said he was happy to have received such a benefit for insulting the princess. Rosika didn't care who would win. She was more embarrassed that the guardians would hear such an embarrassing bet. The prince thanked Princess Rosika and promised that he would keep his dignity safe. In sound, the rogue turned to His Majesty and asked him why he had acted so rashly. He said that she herself called him a eunuch and asked him from that moment on to have his own head on his shoulders. Rixit asked how it was possible to work without trust, and Rosika reminded him that, in reality, she was a fraud. He said that her good character was dangerous for him and that anyone could have hidden the knife. Even Rosika. She was glad that Rixit didn't doubt her, but he could have found a much better way. She didn't expect His Highness to use his family heirloom and make a contract. Rixit said that if the prince weren't a castrate, then he would certainly fall on his face and fulfill his promise. He reminded the rogue that from the beginning he had promised not to doubt and to believe in her completely. Rixit said that he would trust him unconditionally, but warned that betraying him was not worth it. And then he added that nothing could be done and that it was his destiny, instead of simply burying the scoundrel. She looked at the prince, who started talking as if he were threatening, and then let it go. Rosika reflected that on the day they met, she thought she knew everything about His Majesty. She wondered if she now had the courage to betray a man who said those things so naturally. Rixit said that when he saw Elfio, he hoped the prince would raise the stakes, and apologized if he had complicated things. He started to leave and asked the rogue not to let what was happening get into her head. But she stopped him. She grabbed him by his clothes and asked him if he believed that if he knelt down, everything would return to normal. Rixit froze and began to get nervous when the little rogue asked him this terrible question. She stared at him with her big blue eyes and told him to remember this. From the moment he asked to be placed on the throne, he was not obligated to kneel before anyone. The king scolded his son after hearing about the incident with the maid and thought that the prince had gotten into trouble again. The prince asked if the king had gone blind and showed him that his teeth had fallen out. The king was worried about something else. He was worried about what his son had done. The prince began to tell how beautiful the maid was and explained that the king himself would not have been able to stand it, for which he received a slap in the face. The king said he didn't care and ordered them to behave quietly because this friendship was important to them. The prince said he only listened to his dog and didn't make any decisions on his own. The king said he had built his reputation with sweat and blood, and that he wouldn't forgive him if he ruined everything. The prince, with blood on his face, looked at the king and said in front of the princess that he was nothing more than a toothless tiger in the eyes of the empire. The sister asked him why Princess Rosika had attacked him in his own room. The prince began to speak rudely and said that she had guided His Majesty as she wished. She called him shameless, and he, angry, insulted her and told her to know her place. The prince intimidated the princess by telling her that he could kill her and Vita when he became king. He told her that in a couple of days, a very interesting event awaited her and asked her to prepare. The princess left the room hurriedly, and the defeated prince waved his hand behind her. Smiling, he thought that in 2 days, nothing would change, and His Majesty would be at his feet. The prince thought he would enjoy his humiliation, but he didn't need the title of king. He rubbed his beard and came to the conclusion that he wanted to make a special deal with the Archduke. In a large white hall, 3 respected men were sitting at a red table and were discussing Rixit's bet. Emperor Robert van Hexen, holding his head with his hand, said that the scoundrel had completely lost his mind. Raid, second in the line of succession to the throne, laughed and said that this was just a joke by the youngest spirit, and that he could get used to it. Delman Prania, the husband of the emperor's sister, did not approve of such behavior even despite Prince Heron. The butler brought them a letter, and the emperor, scratching his head, said that at 25 one cannot do such nonsense. The emperor turned his head when the butler addressed His Majesty with this letter. His Majesty read the letter and began to sigh loudly. A servant asked him the reason. It was a letter from Crown Prince Raven, asking for a little more rest. The letter said that there were few people in the return procession, so he would appreciate it if imperial knights were sent. The princess had prepared a mountain of gifts for her aunt and uncle and could use more helping hands. That way he would return faster. Delman noted that under such conditions, the prince's return would be delayed, and that he really liked the princess. As a relative, he had to share his opinion and thank Rixit for not betraying his principles. Wright reported that he had read in the letter that Rixit would visit them when he returned from Drax. Delman said it was unlikely he could meet because of the amount of work, and that most likely he would send his wife. Ryder said that in that case, he was obligated to visit the central domains and meet with the crown prince, and return with him. A man in a hood and white mask entered the room and informed Tarantula that they had a problem. A young man was sitting on a pink chair with one eye closed, adorned by a scar, and a Rubik's Cube in his hands. He looked attentively at the masked man and waited for him to tell him the situation in detail. The man turned to the boy and told him the problem was that the crown prince was still alive. Tarantula looked at the man in silence and didn't say a word to him, squeezing the Rubik's Cube tightly in his hand. He lowered his head and began to think, starting to turn his Rubik's Cube in search of a solution. The man called Tarantula scum and demanded not to be ignored, and asked him if he had heard him. Tarantula said he was a corpse, and the man said he had sent a reply letter to the emperor. The boy continued turning the dice, and said he was inclined to believe that the crown prince was alive. He finished solving the cube, threw it on the table, and announced that he was not in a good mood that day. Tarantula squeezed the letter in his hands and said he asked the man to come see him in a couple of hours. He told the man he needed to kill someone to come to his senses. On the table was a torn newspaper containing a photo of Rixit and an article saying that Viper had been executed. The man watched in silence what was happening and concluded that his complaint didn't bother him at all. Tarantula noisily drove the knife into the newspaper with Rixit and ordered the man to leave. He continued talking about the situation with the prince and said he would stop by his property on the way to the palace. The man trembled and asked if Tarantula had doubted him and what he had done wrong. He asked if it was the prince who had written the letter, and he confirmed it because it was his handwriting, and he was alive and well. Tarantula did not believe the mask's words and said that was impossible, since he couldn't be wrong. He took the newspaper with the article from the table and began to look at it carefully, looking for answers. After carefully studying the article, inspiration came to him and he reached a conclusion. He began to laugh hysterically and announced that the letter had indeed been written by the crown prince. Tarantula explained that he had checked the prince's pulse and he was dead, so there couldn't be any mistake. He put the newspaper back on the table and said that nobody died without a reason. He promised the man that he would check it and asked if everything was all right with the girl. The man said he had been following her. Tarantula said he would jump over there, kill someone, and return home. The man tried to understand why he should do that if the defender of the territory was useless. He replied that he would have to do it anyway. Tarantula laughed and asked His Stubborn Highness to stay there and do business. He started staring at him and whispering the same name under his breath, and he was referring to Viper. Tarantula almost lost his composure and thought he had been finished off by a mercenary who looked like a ninja. He looked at the photo of Rixit and thought that the little rogue liked exactly that type of person, and he was even jealous of her. Tarantula continued assembling his cube puzzles and finished solving all the sides. Rixit watched her attentively and asked her what it was that she was constantly spinning in her hands. The pink-haired girl explained that it was a Rubik's Cube, and Rixit said he had never seen one before. The blue-eyed girl looked at His Majesty and said that he had definitely seen this object for the first time. She said there had never been anything like it there before, and that she had assembled it herself for the first time when she was 5 years old. Rosika said she always kept it in her pocket and suggested the prince try it. Rixit took it in his hands and said it was simple and that he would handle the cube the first time. His Majesty spun the cube for a long time, and the little scoundrel said he wouldn't solve it until he started thinking about how it was done. She hugged him from behind and, pointing to the cube, began to tell him that everything had its own formula for success. The little rogue decided to show how it was done and began to slowly turn the cube in Rixit's hands. She looked attentively at the cube and slowly assembled it according to the correct colors. She showed His Majesty different techniques and pointed with her finger how to do it correctly. The pink-haired girl collected the cubes by color, exclaimed "Ta-da," and asked if His Majesty liked it. The rogue asked how the prince was feeling, if he had a fever because he had turned red as a poppy. Rixit started to pretend to yawn, but he was embarrassed, but said that for him everything was fine. Rasika worried while looking at His Majesty, and asked him why he had reacted so abruptly to this. Rixit decided to abruptly change the subject, and asked her why she decided to become a fraudster. His Majesty remembered the rogue's words when she said she was a fraud, and asked her to be careful, and not to trust her. He remembered the expression on her face when she said this, placing her hand on her chest. Rixit asked if the legend about the small children she helped with medicine was a lie. The rogue smiled and said that, of course, it wasn't true, and that she had made it up on the spot. She tilted her back only towards herself, and looked more like an evil witch than a snow-white angel. Rixit remembered the rogue's breathing when she helped him solve the Rubik's Cube. Rasika, when she heard she was a witch, laughed and said thanks for such a warm compliment. She said she took that slippery slope just to get rich quickly. Rixit asked if she was worried about being found and executed. With so much talent, she could have made a good living. She said she never thought about it because she had always been on the wrong path. Rasika took the cube in her hands and, looking at it, wondered if she could really change everything. Rixit didn't want to change the subject and started asking when she really started to become a fraudster. He remembered that it hadn't always been that way, and the first crime started with breaking the lock. Rixit laughed and said that perhaps Rasika was originally just a common thief. And ordinary. She said it was for a good cause because her friend couldn't open her door. She was bullied by scoundrels who hid all her things in a locker and hid the keys to it. This situation happened when Rasika was in the second year of middle school. That was when she realized she was destined to be a rogue. She sat in the classroom and watched everyone around her communicating, but she was completely alone. The girl whose things were stolen and hidden was crying and begged for her locker to be opened so she could get her things out. The aggressor scratched his head and said he wouldn't open it, that he would let her look for the key and open it herself. The girl said she was very worried and that whoever was in the locker could have died sitting there. She explained that the rabbit that was in the cabinet could have suffocated and not survived. The rogue observed this situation and suddenly felt sorry for the girl and her rabbit. He remembered how this girl took great care of her pets with love and fed them vegetables. The rogue saw such absurdity and got very angry, thinking about how to act correctly in that situation. The aggressor looked angrily at the girl and asked what she wanted from her, causing her to tear up. She forbade cutting her new lock of hair and threatened to break her sweet face until it turned blue. The girl trembled as she got up, but she composed herself and put on a determined look. The aggressor saw that impulse and asked where she was going and what she was going to do. She hoped to be able to cut the padlock and then get it back for breaking her new gift. The girl turned around upon hearing these threats, and her face showed fear of being hit in the face. The rogue passed by the offender and greatly surprised her with this strange event. She took the lock in her hands and said that such a cheap lock could hardly be considered a worthy gift. The rogue took a hairpin out of her hair and began to carefully open the locker lock. The schoolgirls watching the thief in action were perplexed and left with their mouths open. She took the rabbit out and, bringing it close to her, said the animal was scared but not hurt. The rogue helped the outcast with her problems, and it was clear that things would only get worse. She was happy when she gave the rabbit back and saw how its owner was happy that it was alive. The delinquent, of course, was very upset because her plans had been ruined, and she looked at her with anger. After this incident, everyone looked at the rogue with suspicion, and she decided that it was worth thinking before doing this. The girl stroked and pitied the scared rabbit while everyone watched in silence. The delinquent asked what it was, but the rogue said the lock was not broken and that there was no tragedy in it. She began to look angrily at the rogue and asked if she had lost all fear. The office door opened, and the teacher entered to teach classes to her students. The teacher asked the students why there was such an unpleasant noise in the classroom. The delinquent reported that she found the thief who stole the phones and the money collected for the trip. She pointed her finger at the rogue and said that it was her who had committed all those crimes. Rasika said that she was slandered by a girl who stole and engaged in stealing. The rogue knew that no one would defend someone who had broken a locker lock in front of everyone. The cheater's mother returned the money and also came to the class and apologized to the teacher. Due to this situation and the loss of 2 million, my mother couldn't buy powdered milk for her younger brother for a whole month. Rixit, upon hearing this, hit the table angrily and called the rogue's offenders scum. This story moved him, and he began to ask where that school was located, and suggested that it was on an island. Rosika said that a lot of time had passed and that there was no need to worry about these events. The rogue laughed and said that she definitely had not let the situation pass. She laughed evilly and said that to get rid of the false accusations, she began to do bad things. The rogue stole many expensive things and a lot of money from the teacher's lounge for her plan. All of this miraculously ended up in the purse of that very mean girl who tricked her. She tried to justify herself in front of the whole class, but no one listened to her, and it was all in vain. Every time they crossed paths, she would trip, and she was the only one who realized that the culprit was the rogue. One day, she was called to the principal's office and given a strict disciplinary sanction. Rosika crossed paths with her and asked if she thought everything would end when she received the fine. She said she would haunt her for the rest of her life so that she would be marked as a thief. In the end, her aggressor confessed to the school principal that it was she who stole the money and set a trap. Fortunately, the mother got all her money back, and the aggressor's parents apologized to her in tears. The girl, repenting for everything, knelt down and asked for forgiveness so that the rogue would let her go. Rosika asked her what she was talking about and decided to forgive her and stop driving the girl crazy. She felt no remorse because, until graduation, she had kept a low profile. Rosika asked what was wrong, and His Majesty said, embarrassed, that everything was fine. He said that if he were Rosika, he would hit all the offenders and throw them in jail. His Majesty praised her for the smooth way she had put the offenders in their place, and she thanked him for the compliment. Rosika looked at Rixit with her big blue eyes and felt a little shy. The rogue said that she had been set up and that she perfectly understood how His Highness felt now. She understood that Rixit was worried that he might be labeled as the crown prince's murderer. Rosika asked him not to worry, because as long as she was with him, that would never happen. Rixit touched the little rogue's fingers and said that he shouldn't have spoken so presumptuously about that. His Majesty lowered his hand and said that, in general, he was not at all worried about it. He said that she was an imposter, and her words might have sounded strange to the pink-haired girl. Rixit listened to her promise that everything would go well and believed with all his heart that she would succeed. He continued by saying that he believed every word she said, and therefore he was not at all worried about what was happening. Rixit considered himself a saint of simplicity and laughing, said that she could reproach him for his simplicity as much as she wanted. He took her hand and told her that even if they tormented him for 100 days in a row, he would not change his mind. Rixit smiled and said that, no matter what happens, he would believe in his advisor Rosika. She asked him what had happened to him, and His Majesty told her that her story had moved him. Rixit promised he would believe her if she stole the safe that was in front of him, and she said she didn't do it. Rosika lowered her head and no longer understood what that stupid man was saying. He said nonsense like a complete idiot, but it really hurt the rogue and stayed right in her heart. She withdrew her hand and offered to break the contract and take everything out of the treasury. Rixit allowed her to have the child at that moment, but promised her that with him, she would not know problems or worries. He said that she could simply stop deceiving him and stay by his side. His Majesty left the room, and before doing so wished the rogue good night. He slammed the door shut, leaving Rosika alone in the room. She remained sitting on the sofa and feeling embarrassed. In the morning, the rogue sat at the table with a mirror and got ready before going out. She was putting on some beautiful earrings in her ears, and suddenly someone knocked on her door, and they asked her if the lady was there. The pink-haired rogue opened the room door and asked what had happened. The King of Vita entered the room accompanied by his butler, Owen, which greatly surprised Rosika. The king turned to Princess Rosika and asked her to spare him some time. He began to tell the princess that yesterday there had been a conflict between Rixit and his son the prince. The king said he really wanted to know the details and went to see His Majesty. The rogue got a little nervous. Princess Rosika was already going over in her head all the possible things Rixit could do, and asked him what he was saying. The king reported that His Majesty had told him how embarrassed the princess was, and that she couldn't react in such a situation. Rosika was surprised by what she heard and thought Rixit was incapable of responding like a human. She was happy for her student, who had come to his senses, and said she had underestimated him. Rosika reported that, when she saw his precious maiden crying in the prince's room, she got furious. The pink-haired rogue wanted to say she wanted to slap him, but suddenly stopped, and got scared. The king looked at her surprised, but the con artist quickly changed her mind and said she was angry. Rosika continued telling the story and said that Rixit lost his temper, and that's why he hit the prince. She said he had behaved extremely rudely and still had a lot to learn from the noble emperor. The king said the princess was not to blame, and that in such a situation anyone would have put two. And two, Rosika reported that yesterday the Archduke was furious and even planned to end his friendship with Vita. She didn't want their relationship with Vita to deteriorate and spent the whole day trying to persuade the prince to change his mind. The king was very happy when he heard the princess say she had persuaded Rixit. Rosika announced that His Highness still considered the Kingdom of La Vita his allies. She continued by saying that the empire valued dignity highly and did not like successors who discredited the people. The king said he had worked very hard to educate his son and would do the best he could in the future. Rosika smiled and thanked him for the promise and said she believed him. She warned that if the friendship with La Vita was not beneficial to Drax, she would stop restraining Rixit. Rosika said that the aristocrats would arrive tomorrow, and she was worried that the prince might ruin everything. The king raised his fist and said he was a cold-blooded man. To those who slaughtered his children, who did not want to abandon barbaric customs in the name of development, the prince knew perfectly well what he could do and did not want to defame his name. Rosika pressed her hand against her chest and said she really wanted her faith in the king not to waver. She was already rubbing her hands in pleasure and saying she hoped this would not happen at the reception. Rosika told the king she wanted to be completely sure and asked him to give her a promise. The rogue asked the butler to bring the prince to the tea table exactly at 2 in the afternoon, and not a minute later. She asked me to tell him that she was going to tell a very interesting story to the noble ladies, and asked for the prince to be brought. The pink-haired girl began to laugh and told the butler that the prince would come running to the tea party like a man in love. Owen knocked on wood and asked why Princess Rosika was so sure of that. He knocked on the prince's door and announced that the nobles had arrived. Prince Harem threw him out and did not leave the room. The prince asked for the princess to be brought to him to settle a dispute. The butler said she was at a tea party and would not appear soon. The butler also said that the lady was going to tell an interesting story at the tea party, and the prince kicked down the door in anger. He called Rosika crazy and ordered the butler to bring him tea as soon as possible. The rogue explained to His Majesty that he didn't have to do anything special, just bring the king at the right time. She told him he had to bring him exactly at 2 in the afternoon, and not a minute before or after. His Majesty took out his gold watch, and looking at the time, concluded that they were a little early. He stopped abruptly, surprising the king, who asked the Archduke what had happened. The king shared that he regretted not apologizing enough to Princess Rixit. He said there was no need to worry. His Majesty expressed his gratitude to the king for visiting the princess and apologized. The king praised the princess and regretted that his children were not like her, and Rixit apologized for hitting the prince. The old man promised that he had spoken to the prince and promised him that he would not create any more problems. The opportune moment had already arrived, and the king and His Majesty were approaching the right spot. In the courtyard, near the bushes with pink flowers, the aristocrats sat at a table and had tea. Among them was Princess Rosika, who was keeping up a pleasant conversation with her interlocutors and preparing the plan. The rogue observed as someone ran towards the table and scared the aristocrats sitting at the tea party. The king and His Majesty arrived on time and found that something terrible was happening at this tea party. The old man was horrified, and Rixit lost his temper and asked what that vile bastard had allowed himself to do. In front of them was Crown Prince Harem, who had pulled down his pants and was scaring the aristocrats with his household items. Before, the rogue asked the aristocrat if the ring on her finger was the same one that was released in the last collection. The girl raised her hand, showing the ring, and was glad that Princess Rosika knew about it. She said that Corin's personal master came to her to make it exclusively for her. The girl decided to give a gift to the princess and asked the craftsman to personally make her a ring. Rosika said it was a great honor for her, and that calling such a master would cost a fortune. The girl said she could afford it, and all the girls were delighted with her words. Rosika looked attentively at her knees, where the keys were, and waited for all the cards to fall into place. She reasoned that if Butler Owen had calculated the time well, the plan would soon be put into action. Rosika decided it was time to start, and asked if the aristocrats wanted to hear a new story. She began to say that before arriving in Drax, she did not know the rumors about the Archduke's relationships with women. Princess La Vita holding a teacup in her hands, became very interested in this information. The aristocrat said there was a rumor that Rixit had never been intimate with a lady in his life. The princess said she had heard about this for the first time, but the girl added that the whole empire knew it. Rasika said that if that was true, then it was a problem, because all those rumors were nothing more than fiction. The girl was attentive and began to ask Rasika how she knew those details. She said it was all slander, and that she had seen His Majesty in the company of girls several times. Rasika reasoned that the rumors about Rixit's impotence should surely decrease after this. The rogue saw how the crazy prince and his butler were approaching her table. Princess Lavita began to ask what rumors they were talking about, and Rasika observed how the prince approached them. She began to say that there was a rumor that His Highness, and holding a cup of tea. She said he was impotent, and that was the word Prince Lavita heard. The prince shouted the princess's name all over the garden, and was surprised when she announced it to everyone. Jaren was beside himself with anger, and, clenching his fist, did not know the best way to deal with the situation. He began to accuse Rasika of spreading rumors without having any proof. Princess Lavita slammed her fists on the table and told him to get lost and not bring shame to her kingdom. He really scared the girls and said that no one dared to say such nonsense about the future ruler of Lavita. The aristocrats began to whisper and tried to understand why Prince Lavita was so upset by the rumors. Jaren was confused and in a panic, did not know how to act correctly in this situation. He began to pull at his pants and shouted with all his might that he had real man's pants. The pants fell to the ground, and the aristocrats began to scream in horror after such a bad action. He began to prove to Rasika that she was wrong and that there was no point in talking. She was saying there was nothing to see. Rixit hugged Princess Rasika and covered her eyes with his hands, asking if the prince had gone crazy. The king was horrified by what was happening and could not say a single word due to such humiliation. His Majesty was furious and asked if the prince was going to put his pants back on. He continued to cover Rasika's eyes and said that he still hadn't pulled his pants up to his butt. The king closed his eyes in embarrassment, called the people, and ordered them to arrest the prince for his action. The prince told the king there was a reason for this and defended his dignity before the princess. But the king did not want to listen to him. He declared that he was not a castrate, but an heir, and he could not ignore it when they tried to discredit his honor. Princess Lavita reported that no one was even talking about him. They were only talking about rumors about His Majesty. The prince was very surprised to hear this, and looking at the princess, asked her to repeat what she had said. He twisted and turned, trying to free himself from the bonds, and said that Princess Rasika had simply tricked him. Haram looked at His Majesty and the princess with horror, and waited for them to answer him. He began to say that the Archduke was convinced of everything, and was obliged to fulfill the oath he himself had made. The prince asked if he would leave his red treasure, and be forced to kneel if everything was in order there. Princess Lavita tried to console the king, and the prince thought that if he saw the truth, he would forgive him. Rasika asked the esteemed prince if he remembered the exact terms of their heated argument. She said that if the prince did not end up impotent in 2 days, then His Majesty would fall prostrate before him. Rasika said that today was not that day, and that there were still 8 hours and 50 minutes left until the end. She turned to the king and asked him if he would keep the promise he had made to the princess. The king gritted his teeth, looked at his bound son, and gave the order to cut off his head. Haram hoped the king would not do this, because he was the only heir. The princess was horrified when she heard the king say to take Haram away and cut off his head. The prince was desperate. He was kneeling, tied up, screaming, and tears of horror flowed from his eyes. Everyone watched in silence as the screaming Prince Haram was carried away by the guards who were about to cut off his head. Princess Rasika clasped her hands and apologized sincerely for causing so much noise. She said everyone was very eager for this meeting, but it made everyone feel uncomfortable. The girls consoled her. Princess Lavita dismissed the king, who had become ill, and returned to have tea. Rasika sat next to her and silently squeezed the princess's hand as a sign of her support for what had happened. She said that the prince behaved inappropriately in front of the guests. But that does not mean that the king and the princess are bad people. The aristocrat with the ring said she had nothing against the princess and the king. Other aristocrats shared that it was very unpleasant, and they hoped that no one else would know about this incident. The girls supported Princess Rasika and promised they would not tell anyone about this event. She thanked the girls for their concern and suggested they meet tomorrow, but with a smile on their faces. His Majesty and the butler were in the same room and remained silent. Without looking at each other, Owen asked Rixit what had happened, but he himself still couldn't wrap his mind around it. He was analyzing what was happening. He clearly remembered that he had invited the La Vida people to strengthen political ties. But Rasika didn't like the prince. In this simple way, she managed to remove the successor to the throne and secure this place for the princess. The butler said he hadn't thought about the success and implementation of such an incredible plan. Rixit made a crazy face and smiling said that it really worked. Owen said that Prince Haram was now hanging by a thread, but had lost his right to the throne completely. The king will fulfill his promise as soon as they return home, since he cannot shed his son's blood in another country. Rixit became nervous and said that a simply terrifying thought had occurred to him. He asked what would have happened if he hadn't disobeyed the butler and kidnapped the rogue, and she had worked for someone else. The butler said it gave him goosebumps, and that in that case, Rixit would be in the prince's place. His Majesty also felt chills and said that the butler was absolutely right about that. Rasika read her plan, which included eliminating the prince and promoting the princess, and read what should be done next. The next plan was to find the crown prince's murderer and turn Rixit into emperor through connections with the northern aristocrats. The rogue was furious about the fact that she was always stumbling, because she didn't know who was who among the invited aristocrats. She wrote useful information for him on a piece of paper, and knocking on his door, asked if he was there. The rogue continued knocking on the door in hopes of an answer, but only heard silence. Rasika began to wonder why His Majesty was not answering her, and assumed he was sleeping. She was very angry, because she had been running around and working since early in the morning. And this Rixit allowed himself to sleep at this hour. The rogue hoped to wake His Majesty, and hit the door as hard as she could. No one opened the door, and she began to get even angrier, and thought that Rixit was playing with her nervousness. She hit the door so hard that it flew open, and entering the room, she asked why His Highness was sleeping. Princess Rasika was distressed when she saw something she shouldn't have seen with her own eyes. The Archduke was completely naked and coming out of the shower, drying his body with a towel. She realized that a pink-haired rogue was standing in the room, and was looking at him with horror, standing naked in front of her. They looked into each other's eyes and couldn't say a word, as they were very embarrassed with each other. Rixit looked at Rasika with the paper in her hands and didn't understand why she was there, and why she was hanging around there. His Majesty realized that he was standing naked in the middle of the room where his advisor was. The little rogue asked why His Majesty would be there, and asked why she was there. She came to her senses and began to wave her arms, hoping that His Majesty would come to his senses and get dressed. The little rogue immediately started running out of the room because she felt very uncomfortable and embarrassed. The rogue slammed the door shut and stood with his back to it for a few seconds, trying to understand what had happened. She grabbed her head, trying to remember what she had seen in the room today. Rasika said she wasn't the only one to blame, because she had been knocking on Rixit's door for a long time. She was very embarrassed and sorry. She said she apologized profusely to His Majesty. She reflected that she had guessed Rixit had a toned body, but saw something she didn't expect. The rogue couldn't organize her thoughts and remained embarrassed by what had happened. She remembered how the maids gossiped about his impotence, but she didn't believe it without proof. Rasika was more inclined to believe that His Majesty was simply ashamed to communicate with girls he didn't know. She knew that he had many advantages. He was handsome, rich, there were a couple of rumors, but the advantages outweighed the advantages. His Majesty was also a real dragon, but it was a mystery because no one had ever met one. Rasika was surprised, thinking she had been thinking about something stupid and that she needed to stop. She apologized to His Majesty again, and hoping he had gotten dressed. She asked him to come in. There was no answer from Rixit's room, and only silence could be heard. She entered carefully and asked why Rixit was silent, and if he really didn't want to see her. He had already gotten dressed and was scratching the back of his neck, looking at the floor and not answering the princess. He felt embarrassed, and the little rogue asked him if he was okay and how he was feeling in general. He tapped his ears with his hand, as if he were getting water out, and Rasika asked him if his ears hurt. His Majesty stopped abruptly and looked at the pink-haired rogue who was nearby. He looked into her big blue eyes and told the advisor that he hadn't heard her until that moment. The butler began to list the people who were in the castle, and said that they also had similar symptoms. Around 8 o'clock at night, several nobles staying in the castle suddenly complained of hearing loss. Everything became clear to her after all. She had been calling out to Rixit's room for a long time and had received no response. The cook thought he was to blame, but the rogue reassured him by explaining that then everyone would get sick. About 100 nobles were invited to the castle, and all of them, suddenly, lost their hearing because of something. Rasika asked how the nobles were feeling in general. The butler replied that many were under the supervision of the servants. He said that after dinner, all the nobles were drinking tea, and at that moment the disaster occurred. Rasika confirmed that that was exactly how it happened, and that it was around 1 in the afternoon. Just after lunch, she calculated that 8 hours had passed, and only one substance could have such properties. They were clear, and the rogue said it was the butler who was in front of her who was preparing the tea. He confirmed and said it was the same tea that the Baron gave them upon their arrival at the castle. They took out the package the Baron had given them, unfolded it, and began to carefully examine its contents. The rogue began to smell the tea and wondered what it would taste like if it was Claris or Palarum. She held the unfolded package in her hands and couldn't believe what she now saw in front of her. The rogue understood that plutonium was a poisonous plant that melted eardrums and nerves in 24 hours. The pink-haired girl looked at her watch and calculated that they only had 18 hours left to solve the problem. The butler wanted to arrest the Baron, but the princess said it wasn't necessary, since he was drinking tea, and asked for the doors to be closed. She stared at Owen, the butler, and announced that no one should leave the castle during that time. The butler and the princess looked at poor Rixit and worried because they had little time. Rasika said the first thing she would do was take care of His Majesty's well-being. She took out a notepad and began to write text on a piece of paper. The rogue showed it to Rixit and asked if he had heard anything. Rixit read the message on the notepad and nodded in agreement. She wrote on a piece of paper that this happened to him due to the tea they drank at lunch today. The pink-haired girl said she would start creating an antidote and said it wouldn't take even 10 minutes. Rixit agreed, and the rogue hurried to prepare the necessary antidote as quickly as possible. She began to crush the antidote in a mortar and, with wide eyes, reasoned that this was an attempt on Rixit's life. She reasoned that the Baron was not smart enough to do this on purpose, and that someone was behind him. The rogues thought it might be Ride, but he could only do it if he got rid of all the competitors for the throne. The pink-haired girl continued preparing the antidote and said it was all her fault, and that she hadn't realized that Rixit could have been targeted. She thought about how stupid she had been and blamed herself for being so careless. The pink-haired girl cried, telling herself that she had boasted about never making mistakes, and she repeated this at every moment of success. The rogue was desperate about what had happened and simply wanted to break the table with her mortar. Rixit took her hand and began to look into her tear-filled eyes. He was very worried about her. He told the rogue that she was okay and waited for the advisor to make him the antidote. Rixit touched the cheeks of the embarrassed little rogue and asked her why she was crying, and asked her not to cry. His Majesty was worried because he had made his precious advisor shed tears because of him. Rasika looked pitifully at the Archduke and asked for forgiveness, crossing her arms over her chest. Rixit watched with pleasure as the rogue prepared the antidote and pounded it with a mortar. His Majesty asked the pink-haired girl why she was apologizing to him so fervently. He asked the con artist to stop crying and asking for forgiveness, as that didn't suit her at all. Rasika looked at His Majesty and promised not to do that to him again. She was sure that it was not the time to get carried away by emotions and began to diligently prepare the antidote. Rasika nervously began to crush the antidote, promising that once she resolved the situation, she would kill the enemies. The idea that she couldn't be taken by surprise tormented her. That feeling of shame was beyond her understanding. Rixit watched the pink-haired girl work carefully, and she informed him that this piece was difficult to grind. The rogue said there was still time, but she wanted to finish the work as quickly as possible. The con artist opened her little mouth and carefully placed the green pineapple in it. Rixit was curious about what the princess was doing and began to describe the whole process on paper. He described all the ingredients of the antidote and added that he didn't have this one separately. The note said she could replace it with her saliva since she was busy now. She would explain later. She asked him if Rixit was disgusted, and he began to fidget nervously with his neck and his button. Rasika said she wanted to do it in the way least unpleasant to the eyes and senses. She approached His Majesty's lips, and he began to ask her how she planned to do this. Rasica demanded that the Archduke not ask unnecessary questions and open his mouth as quickly as possible. The rogue looked at His Majesty, as if she were preparing to continue and getting ready. She began to kiss Rixit to share her saliva. He gently took her hand. The con artist noticed that the Archduke was visibly nervous and decided it was his first kiss. She realized that the rumors that he hadn't even held a hand were true, and she noticed that he had gotten carried away and was grabbing her by the waist. Rixit pressed her against him and began to stroke her back, and the little rogue wondered why he had chosen that position. She couldn't do anything because she had to deliver the antidote and wondered if it was a kiss then. Rasica realized where this process was heading and pushed Rixit away, explaining that they were done. She began to get embarrassed and shake her head, and then asked if they were sure they were finished, and if that was enough. The rogue confirmed that they were finished and began to wrap His Majesty in a blanket. She wrote on a piece of paper that the antidote would take effect in approximately 2 hours, and that he would regain his hearing. Rasica explained that it was quite strange not to hear anything, and asked him to close his eyes and sleep. She said she had to give the antidote to the others, and that he had to sleep. And Rixit began to pull her towards him. He was worried that the rogue would give the antidote to others the same way she had given it to him. Rasica said she didn't want rumors about the saliva to spread and for everyone to guess that she was the viper. She said she wanted to add the antidote to the tea and distribute it to all the sick guests. She touched Rixit's hair again and began to close the door, wishing him good night. His Majesty tried to sleep, but he kept tossing and turning in bed, and his heart was about to burst out of his chest. He was going crazy trying to figure out if it was a kiss or the transfer of the antidote, and why she stuck out her tongue then. Butler Owen opened the door with a creak and entered to inform His Majesty that the Countess's hearing had returned to normal. He bribed the doctor and asked him to prescribe more medication, and then everyone, without hesitation, started asking him for more. Rasica asked to hire him as the Archduke's doctor, and since he had been bribed, they would have to keep him close. Several nobles were angry, but the situation was resolved favorably, and she didn't think the poisoner had taken the poison intentionally. Rasica stated that she was not yet ready to let anyone go, and Rixit personally assured her that in the morning he would find out how the poisoning occurred. He was going to gather everyone tomorrow and explain the situation to them. The rogue praised them for their good work. The butler looked carefully at the rogue, called her incredible, and thanked her for staying with them. She laughed and said she had been forced to do it, and that it was the butler who suggested it. Owen said that they eventually became friends, and that there was no point in remembering the bad things that happened in the past. The butler suggested finding the person behind all these crimes. Perhaps it was Reed's work. The rogue thought for a moment and explained that it would be necessary to obtain evidence to confirm this theory. It won't be easy, since the trail didn't even lead to the Baron. He didn't even know the tea was poisoned. The rogue decided to find out about the tea situation in the morning and ensured that the doors were locked, and that not a single rat could escape. The pink-haired girl placed the cards she was holding in her hands and tried to figure out who needed this by looking at the kings. She looked at the cards and thought that so far she had only lost once, but the next time could be fatal. She had no intention of checking the extent of Wright's stupidity because she thought it was obvious. The pink-haired girl thought she started acting because she received a letter from the Crown Prince. It took 10 days for the mail to be delivered and returned, and the fact is that the real killer had started acting again. This is why the reaction against the poison tea was planned through subterfuge. The rogue assumed that Rixit had been the target from the beginning. The butler had noticed how meticulous he was as an assassin. Rasica felt uncomfortable about having been taken by surprise and said she hadn't felt that way in a long time. The pink-haired girl brought the map to her lips and began a true brainstorming session in her head. She continued shuffling the cards and thinking about what to do until Rixit became emperor. The rogue grabbed the cards in her hands and promised herself that, until that happened, she would not lose. Rixit was very scared when he met the rogue. She said she was on her way to him. His Majesty felt embarrassed and asked why the rogue was interested in knowing if his hearing had returned and if it had improved. Rixit put his hands on his hips and said he felt very good today. The rogue put her hand on his forehead and began to ask him about his fever, about his hearing, and if he had been left stunned. She said he would have a little fever and would be feverish for half the day with slight dizziness. Rixit confirmed this fact and said he was looking for her precisely for that reason. He began to ask the pink-haired girl if she was human or not, and where she got the poison from if she didn't take it every day. The little rogue began to ramble and began to tell what she wanted to tell, but almost forgot. She showed the bottle and said that if they were being hunted, they needed to be fully armed. The pink-haired woman said she had excellent control over her body, but that in other cases, one had to prepare. She said this bottle contained all existing poisons in low concentrations, and this helped develop immunity. Rixit was very scared and began to ask the rogue where she had gotten that bottle from. Rasika lowered her gaze, became shy, and said she had obtained these poisons from her saliva. She expected such a reaction, so she was going to intoxicate His Majesty without giving him any details. The cunning woman explained that there was very little saliva and that Rixit wouldn't detect it. They would start with 1 dose per day, and then they would increase the dose. Rasika said that even if he didn't want to, he had no other choice and would have to accept the conditions. She said that if he broke into the world of politics, there would be many more assassination attempts. But Rixit was worried about the saliva. Rasika began to explain that this was necessary, and His Majesty began to explain that it's not that he didn't need immunity. The rogue began to look at him and wait with embarrassment for him to tell her what he meant. Rixit blushed and said he knew the least disgusting way to transmit her poisons. He began to approach her and asked if they could do to him what they had done last time. Rixit didn't expect her to say that at all, and his head began to spin from surprise. Rasika began to look at him as if he were a piece of meat, and His Majesty even shuddered when he saw this. She asked if His Majesty was sure he was so squeamish that he couldn't take the poison any other way. Rixit was the man who had been on the battlefield and had tried everything. He said he could do anything, and suddenly he changed his mind and wouldn't try it. It seemed very disgusting to him, and his conscience pricked him. Rasika said that if he was squeamish, they would use a different method, and he would drink the diluted solutions separately. Rixit turned around so as not to look into her eyes, and began to say that he agreed. Since there was no other way out, he said that at any moment they could add poison to his food, and that he had to develop resistance to poisons. Rixit said this was very important, because if he died, Rasika would go to the grave with him. The rogue was already laughing, seeing how His Majesty was trying to come up with new excuses, and she asked if it was only necessary to do it once. She said she would start with a single dose, and then increase the dose until he finally got used to it. Rasika warned Rixit that initially they would be accompanied by fever, dizziness, and nausea. Silence fell, and the con artist began to hear how loudly His Majesty's heart was beating. She began to greet Rixit and was worried about him, asking if he was okay, and if he was even there. Rasika said that at the end of every day, as soon as he finished his work, he should come to her room. She was curious about this week's reaction and was making calculations in her notes. His Majesty exhaled loudly, closed his eyes, and announced that now he was definitely ready. Rasika asked why, and he began to wave his arms loudly and shout that he was ready to train his immunity. The con artist displeased the Archduke greatly and warned him that he definitely couldn't do that day. She said that up to this day, he had already taken the maximum dose of poison and could no longer do it. His Majesty's jaw dropped, which made the pink-haired poisonous con artist laugh very loudly. She asked him to go to bed early, since tomorrow he had to deal with the Baron who had given him the tea. Rixit agreed with the advisor's words and walked awkwardly toward the exit. After wishing her good night, Rasika, seeing this scene, began to laugh joyfully and called His Majesty a great beauty. In the morning, the Baron and his son were very scared when a tube of poisoned tea was thrown onto the table in front of them. Rixit informed the Baron that the tea contained poison, which had harmed him, and the local nobles who drank it. He said that if they start hiding from the place where they brought it, their heads will roll today. The Baron was very scared and asked if it was really because of this tea that the nobles had lost their hearing. Rasika noticed the Baron's reaction and realized that they were disheartened, and it was definitely not a simulation. The Baron's son said his father was not to blame. He had found this tea among the merchants because they couldn't afford a more expensive gift. Rasika knew these were not the richest nobles, but how did they get such expensive tea? She declared that she didn't blame them. For her, it was important to discover exactly how they got the poisoned tea. Akel brought it about 3 months ago. They took pity on him and hired him as a servant on the estate. Akel promised to buy a gift for the Archduke so that the Baron's family wouldn't look bad at the reception. Rixit asked where he was. If he had arrived with them, The Baron said he had arrived with them, but hesitated for a moment. He was with them until his father regained his hearing, and after that he was not seen anymore. Rixit. He was scared at this information. Rasika asked if all the doors had been locked yesterday so that not a single shadow could escape the castle. The butler confirmed this fact and reported that he could not escape and hid in the castle. Rixit watched the two whisper and was disgusted that they were having some kind of secret discussion. They began to tell Rixit that they had important matters to attend to, which surprised His Majesty very much. They ran through the palace one after another, and the butler asked her if she was going to catch him with him. The butler began to boast that the success rate of his missions as an assassin was almost 100%. The rogue pointed out that it was almost that way. He revealed that he had failed to kill Rixit, which greatly surprised the rogue running after him. The butler drew his weapon and said that he was not the only one, but that many had tried to do the same thing, but that he would tell the story on another occasion. Owen asked the lady to go back and wait while he brought the rat within an hour. Rasika said that was too long and that, knowing their psychology, she could handle it in a minute. She said that if she told the butler what he was like, it would be boring, and she wanted to see who would catch him first. Rasika took off the necklace with the stone and asked the butler to help her unzip her back. He was surprised that it was so sudden and said that she was not his type and that he didn't like beautiful women in general. Rasika laughed and asked him to stop saying nonsense and take off her dress. The zipper buzzed and the princess took off her dress, revealing a comfortable black leather suit underneath. The butler looked at the rogue's outfit and asked if she had prepared in advance to catch the criminal. She said that one never knows what is going to happen and that one must always be on guard, especially in moments like these. The little rogue jumped nimbly onto the windowsill and said she would go herself, and asked me to take care of her dress. The butler heard her request but said that, as a former assassin, he couldn't afford the luxury of losing prestige. A blonde man with a white shirt and black pants was sitting in a corner and was looking at the floor, waiting. He understood that he still had to wait, and that if they caught him now, he most likely wouldn't survive. The blonde man remembered how the man had asked to give this tea to Rixit, and the guild leader had paid only 5% of the amount. Now he understood that it was impossible to even survive on those pennies, and he regretted having made the deal. He called himself stupid Akel and felt pity for himself, thinking that there was nothing more valuable than his own life. The boy began to cry out of fear and remembered how he, a fool, had been given advice at the end. A girl told him he had to be on guard every second. That way he definitely wouldn't get lost. She asked him why he believed Tarantula, even if he was his brother. He still abandoned him. Akel said that he had also guided her, and that was why they were now in that dungeon. She asked him what he meant by that, and told him that she was there of her own free will. The girl lifted her skirt and showed that she had a bunch of valuable jewels on her legs that she had stolen. She started to open the lock with a hairpin, and the blonde asked when she had managed to steal them. The lock made a metallic noise and opened after being forced, and the dungeon door began to creak as it opened. Akel said there was no point in leaving, since the guards would still see them. She called the guy a fool and asked if anyone had ever escaped from the dungeon through the main door. The girl asked the blonde if he had any more questions and informed him that their paths diverged here. She wished him luck and hoped he would get out of there alive and well. Akel fell before her and, trembling with fear, begged her to take him with her and save him. Calling her little sister, he didn't let go of her green dress and begged her with tears in his eyes not to leave him there. The girl felt a little disgusted looking at the boy and asked him what was wrong. She looked carefully at Brother Tarantula, and an interesting plan began to form in her head. The girl said that if he helped her, he would be rewarded, and in his next life he would be born a rich person. She told me to listen carefully and explained that there were underground passages to drain sewage. The girl raised her hand and explained that absolutely all the movements were designed in the same way. The boy went down into the sewers and thanked Sister Viper for the tip. He didn't suspect that his sister could leave at that moment. He thought the fraud would provide them with a comfortable life. Akel raised his head and saw dust falling from his steps, and realized it was a man. He realized that he was not allowed to make a single sound, and that if they discovered him, everything would end very badly for him. The hatch above the boy's head began to open, and he began to shake violently with fear. Sitting in the hole, it was the masked rogue, who greeted the trembling blonde man sitting in the pit. The butler, who saw her open the hatch, informed the rogue that she was only a second late. He said that he had also thought of that place, but at one point, he simply took the wrong path. Owen jerked sharply toward the blonde and began to look at him closely, never stopping smiling. He turned to Akel and asked the respected rat to come out as quickly as possible. The blonde man was tied to a large chair and swore to His Majesty that he had no idea the tea was poisoned. Rixit said he had difficulty understanding more than 2 words by ear and asked them to answer yes or no. He began to interrogate the man and asked him who exactly had given him that tea, or who had bribed him to do it. Rixit started shouting at the guy and continued interrogating him. He wanted to know who had given him that tea. The butler reminded him that His Majesty demanded the answer be yes or no, and asked him to think before answering. With a knife to his face, he said he received orders from the guild and received 10 million for tea. Rixit said that even a fool could see it was a scam. The blonde apologized and said that greed played a role. The butler asked who gave the order, and Akel said he didn't know, since he received requests from the guild leader. Owen said he only has 10 fingers on his hands, which means he has 10 attempts to give the correct answer. Akel asked them to believe him because he was only telling the pure truth and continued saying he didn't know. Everyone turned when they heard a metallic noise and froze, waiting for what would happen next. It was the rogue who said they were like people who interrogate a man by cutting off his fingers. Rasika looked at the blonde and said they brought him here to skin the poor guy. Akel was very scared when he heard about being skinned, but His Majesty told him that he didn't practice such a thing. Rixit told the rogue that the blonde man had only said that the order had been given to him by the guild leader. The boy began to listen to their words and began to think about what his 18 years of life experience were telling him. He realized that the most dangerous figure there wasn't the 2 rude men, but that sweet princess. She asked the butler to go to that same guild and turn everything upside down there. Rasika wanted to demonstrate Rixit's anger. As if he were throwing thunder and lightning, she needed to make him look like a simpleton. Akel lowered his head and asked if he had heard too much information from them. It was clear why the princess had hidden her whiteness and fluffiness and heard her ask for a knife. The butler said he didn't have a knife, and the girl told him to take it from behind his back and give it to her. Rasika didn't understand why Rixit was so worried that she wouldn't see a drop of blood, and thought she was spoiled. The rogue was sick of the whole farce and asked him to give her the knife and not make a circus of it. She took a knife and approached the blonde man. She looked at him closely and thought about how she would torture him. Suddenly, Rasika pointed the knife at Akel's throat, which scared the poor young man a lot. She waved the knife, and the boy closed his eyes, hoping nothing bad would happen to him. The rogue cut the back of his shirt and saw a large scar that extended across his entire back. She said she did it because the hostage had the same name as someone she knew. Rasika said she didn't immediately believe it was Akel and asked how he managed to survive. The guy looked closely at the rogue and began to ask if they knew the princess. He brought his hand to his chest and announced that she was the same con artist called Viper. Akel began to dig through his memories and remembered a blonde girl holding a bucket in her hands. She met Akel when she was 6 years old, and they separated when she was about 12. In her memory, only 2 poor people vaguely remained, the boss called Tarantula, and his younger brother, Akel. Tarantula was the smartest person she had ever met in her 2 lives. It is not easy for a girl to survive alone, so she joins a gang of homeless children. She clearly remembered the blonde man and realized that Tarantula's presence in her life was a true blessing. He was an expert in all poisons, and in various fields, it was he who gave her the nickname Viper. Tarantula didn't look like a 9-year-old boy, and his hair was an unusual color, and she assumed that perhaps he wasn't from there either. Rasika was afraid of Tarantula, whom she could never understand, although he never refused her requests. He sold the homeless children he picked up to a strange nobleman, and not even his brother was an exception. She counted the days until she could leave the group, but didn't have time, and when they caught her, she was already planning how to rob the castle. Akel was different, unlike Tarantula. He was a soft, tearful, and very trusting boy. All he did was constantly trust her and cry tirelessly, complaining about his fate. So when they finally escaped from the castle, she hesitated, and now they had to be even more careful. Rasika noticed there were traps scattered everywhere and that she needed to watch out for them. Akel quickly got his foot caught in one of the traps and lay on the ground, frozen with pain. If the trap snaps shut, nearby guards will immediately receive a signal that someone has been caught. The guards would normally run for 5 minutes, but it would take about 3 minutes to get free from the trap. It was impossible to hide with the injured man, and she apologized. But the guy said his sister had to leave. Akel thanked her for helping him get out of that damn dungeon, but now he let her go. She called him a fool and asked who should worry about whom now, and smiled. Rasika dismantled the trap, but the wound was deep and they couldn't escape quickly. The rogue realized they had no chance and began to run away, leaving Akel alone on the ground. The guards discovered the boy and began to shout to their companions that the fugitive was there. The man raised his weapon over the blonde and said that rats always came out one after another. They hit him on the back and began to ask if he had escaped alone or if there were others. But he said he had escaped alone. Rasika felt pity for that silly 9-year-old boy, but he would have given away her position, and she couldn't have acted any other way. He was a loyal man, unlike his brother, and even though he thought it would be of no use, she threw a stone at the trap. Viper asked Akel to stay still and not move under any circumstances, and not to lift his head. The guards looked at each other and realized there was another fugitive who had given away the situation. Akel felt sorry for his little sister, and the guards rushed to catch her as quickly as possible so their master wouldn't scold them. The blonde heard sharp sounds behind him and realized that the guards were falling to the ground. Upon looking up, he saw how the guards who had tried to kill him were torn in half. He said that such traps were used in wars. When someone stepped on them, invisible blades appeared in the air. The blades were at the height of the boy's stomach and neck. The owner was willing to kill the children, just so they wouldn't escape. She ordered me to prepare myself and, overcoming the pain, to crawl toward her, but without lifting my head under any circumstances. Rasika promised that she would never let him die if the little one did what she asked. Akel felt very inspired by what Viper told him and decided to save his life. He looked at Rasika and began to crawl slowly, despite the pain, toward her. Without lifting his head, Viper initiated the reaction and eliminated all the traps, and Akel arrived safe and sound to his sister. She said that 2 guards at the south gate had had their legs cut off, and that the southeast detachment would arrive in 2 minutes. Akel asked how they could escape then, and the rogue asked if he was sure he could escape. They simply walked laboriously along the wall, and the blonde was very worried that his little sister would be caught because of him. He asked her for forgiveness, and asked his little sister to leave him and run away alone, but she just ordered him to remain silent. Rasika turned to him and asked if he had heard that the oil lamp was dark on the inside. The guards searched the area for the fugitives, and, talking among themselves, they shouted that there were 2 fugitives. They reported that one was seriously injured, and that if they were caught, the owner would take their lives. The commander of the guards reasoned that the children could run wherever they looked, and were eager to escape the castle. Rasika was sure that the 14 guards had already gone deep into the forest in their search. She took the hand of her little blonde and told him it was time to move on and escape from the castle. Later, she healed Akel's leg and took care of him until he grew stronger, and then announced that it was time for her to leave, and each would go their own way. Akel said that Sister Viper looked completely different and asked if she was really standing in front of him. He began to ask if she was hiding or not, and if her face was fake, and the rogue said that if you know too much, you will get old. She asked him how he had survived then, if he had become a skillful pickpocket, and if he had made a living by stealing. Akel said he kept his promise and started living like a human being, without invading others' property. She had already forgotten those words, but Rixit and the butler knew her as the #1 con artist in the entire empire. Akel said he was able to live a normal life, earning a living honestly and fulfilling orders from the guild. The rogue looked carefully at little Akel and liked what he was saying. She began to praise the blonde and stroked his head in front of His Majesty, who was doubtful. He approached the princess and asked what had just happened. The princess said it was Akel and that they had known each other since childhood. Rixit said it was a very pleasant coincidence to see his older sister before dying. Rasika said they needed to find out who had contacted the guild with the order, but she didn't expect there to be any clues. She said there was no need to kill anyone in the guild, and that it was better to keep young Akel close to her. Rasika said he was her brother in spirit. The Archduke thought she wanted to save him, but she said it was just a childhood acquaintance. She suggested letting him stay and taking a closer look, because such allies were not found lying on the road. The rogue turned to the blonde and told poor Akel that she had saved his life for the second time. He looked at the pink-haired princess and couldn't say a word, watching her smile. His eyes filled with tears, and he began to shed them pitifully, saying his little sister's name. She began to stroke his head and calm him down, and Rixit watched this drama from the side. His Majesty began to strangle the little bastard, and he began to ask Rixit for forgiveness and thank his little sister. He promised that from that moment on he would not get involved in shady deeds, but would become a decent person. Rixit watched them stroking the blonde and felt jealous. He didn't like what was happening. Rasika listened, while the doctor tried to explain to her that the tea was not poisoned, and that the mixture of ingredients was to blame. The rogue repeated that the mixture of tea and fermented collagen caused the problems, and the healer confirmed it. Rasika said the symptoms were the same as the poison, and an antidote was quickly found, which reassured the aristocrats. Rixit said he was glad that not everyone was poisoned, but that he was to blame for the tea and the food that was served on the table. The nobles were surprised to hear that Rixit himself, whom everyone considered a threat, was apologizing to the guests. Everyone began to apologize to His Highness and say that he was not to blame for anything, since he himself was hit. The man asked how they could recognize the symptoms and prepare an antidote so quickly. The doctor said he studied plants while he was on a business trip abroad, and that this knowledge helped him. He said that His Highness invited him to work for him, and he agreed with this decision because there weren't specialists lying on the road. The princess said that if they had any health problems, they could request his services. Everyone in the room greatly appreciated the words of the princess and her new doctor, and thanked them for their work. Rixit combed his hair, dressed elegantly, and pretending this irritated him every day, began to wait for the princess. Rasika said he couldn't just take poison, he had to take Tanita. The Archduke listened to the princess in silence and began to take the tenet, drinking it in quick sips. She warned that, until he developed immunity, he was forbidden to drink anything given to him. Rixit asked if it was poison, and when he discovered it wasn't, he said he had already told her that he trusted her completely. Rasika said she could be trusted, but that he should be careful with others. Rixit looked at his pink-haired advisor and announced that now it was time to take the poison. The rogue paced back and forth, trying to figure out how to approach His Majesty. She offered him her knees and told him he could sit on them and it would be more comfortable. The rogue felt embarrassed at such a proposal and tried to overcome it and decide to do it. She decided that this was the only way to develop immunity to poisons, and it would be more convenient. Rixit looked and realized that at that time, only the two of them were in that room. The rogue continued looking at Rixit and felt embarrassed, afraid to sit on his lap. His Majesty grabbed her hand and began to pull the little rascal toward him to seat her on his lap. He grabbed her by the waist with his hand and, holding her, looked tenderly into the blue eyes of the con artist. Rixit began to slowly approach her lips, and the rogue looked at him tenderly and felt embarrassed by his actions. She raised her hand and asked if she could continue with her work and administer a small dose of poison. The Archduke blushed and became embarrassed and announced that she could begin to prepare the immunity. She reported that he sat her down so suddenly that His Majesty's heart was beating strongly with emotion. Their lips touched, and the rogue began to transfer her poison to Archduke Rixit with her tongue. His Majesty really wanted to touch her with his hands, but he resisted and told himself that was not possible. The princess pushed His Majesty away, but continued to look at him with her sweet eyes. Rixit held the shoulder of the pink-haired con artist and asked shyly if they were done. He didn't want to let go of the princess and held her with his hand behind her back, pressing her against him. Rixit couldn't hold back in taking the princess. He began to hold her in his arms, which surprised her greatly. He didn't understand himself why he was doing this, and after a while he carefully placed her on the sofa and moved away. Rixit moved away from the princess, all red, and said that if they were done, then he would leave. Rasika said it is necessary to understand if there are side effects and wait here for about 10 minutes. He began to shake his head and refused to stay because he said he had already had enough. He said goodbye to the princess and told her that if any side effects arose, he would definitely return to her. Rasika didn't have time to finish speaking before he left, standing at the door. She started calling for Rixit. Rixit ignored her because he was deep in his thoughts and trying to understand what was happening. He was ashamed of his feelings and didn't understand if he was a man or some kind of wild animal. And lustful, Rasika watched this from the side and asked what was wrong with him, if he was aroused, and what they had done. Rasika was disgusted to look at him She considered him an animal that had become aroused and thought he had gotten out of control. That is exactly how Rixit felt when he thought about this situation and thought he needed to drink poison. He remembered what had happened to Prince Heron and thought that the same thing could happen to him too. The butler ran into the room and, seeing how His Majesty was suffering, rushed to ask what had happened to him. He had a knife in his hands and was worried that someone had attacked His Majesty and was ready to protect him. Something really scared the butler, and he began to ask what that abomination was, and to scream throughout the castle. Akel greeted a passing noble, and the weather in the castle was very sunny and warm. Rixit realized that he was waving to him. He approached carefully from behind and said to him, "Hello." The blonde was scared by such a greeting and was scared again when he saw His Majesty behind him. He showed Akel his fist and said that if something like that happened again in the castle, he would lose his mind. The boy said his name was Akel and that he would help the castle and His Highness in everything he could. Rixit asked how long he had known the rogue, and he said that she had joined them when he was 6 years old, and that he had known her for 6 years. His Majesty thought that was long and asked him to tell him in more detail, but the blonde man said he was too young to remember it. He said she was nothing special, just a little girl with blonde hair. Rumors about her spread quickly, and he, reading the articles, guessed who exactly the Viper had been all this time. He remembered how she looked without makeup and smiling. He said she was incredibly beautiful. Rixit got jealous and asked what the idiot had said. He replied that he had said it about himself. Before separating, they were sold to a pervert, and it was during this period that he realized how unusual she was. Rixit called their leader a miracle pea, and Akel said that he was also his older brother. He explained to him that his sister knew they would be sold, and Rixit realized that she had stolen everything that shined from there. The blonde smiled and asked His Majesty what kind of relationship he had with Rasika. He wondered how he had let such an odious girl into the family, and why he had given her that title. Rixit began to talk about relationships, and reached the conclusion that he didn't have any relationship. Akel put his hands behind his head, and told the embarrassed Rixit that his little sister was a true beauty. He said he didn't care about her beauty, and hit the blonde man on the head. The blonde boy said there was nothing wrong with that, and that it was completely normal to have feelings for a beautiful girl. Rixit said Akel was crazy, and asked him when he had ever told him that he liked her. He began to shake his fists to hit the guy, but he skillfully dodged every blow. The blonde didn't understand why Rixit got so worked up and began to attack him with his fists. His Majesty got very angry and began to crack his knuckles, promising to send him to his ancestors. The blonde began to run away quickly from His Majesty and shouted that he would never allow that to happen to him. Rixit noticed that Rasika was definitely different from other representatives of the fair sex. He was always very worried that someone would dare to insult her or raise their hand against her. His Majesty also often went to the princess like this, without having any reason for it. He murmured all this quietly and began to wonder what was happening to him. He accepted it as if the important thing was that he needed her and had to constantly take care of her. Rixit noticed that his advisor, the pink-haired con artist, was talking to a girl with gray hair. She was far away and he could assume it was Farah, the princess of Vita, who was communicating with Rasika. It was clear that the girls were very happy to see each other and were laughing at some funny moment. The Archduke remembered that the kingdom's delegation was leaving today, which is why they were dressed like that. He supposed his little rogue had spent the whole day with Princess Lavita. Farah began to hug the pink-haired con artist very tightly, which surprised Rixit, who was watching them. They continued hugging and rejoicing, and His Majesty didn't understand why this was happening. He watched how they exchanged glances and how close they were to each other, and began to feel jealous of Rasika. Farah took the rogue by the shoulders and kissed her on the forehead, which made Rixit completely lose his balance. Rasika blushed and began to laugh. Looking at Princess Lavita was quite cute. Farah watched as Princess Rasika was grabbed and dragged away with a sudden movement. Rixit took her into his arms, which scared his pink-haired advisor a lot. She was very surprised and asked His Highness what was happening and why he was doing it. Rixit was very nervous and tense and asked the princess if that wasn't what he thought. Farah didn't understand what they were talking about, and His Majesty shouted that he was against such a relationship. She laughed heartily and said what His Majesty was thinking when he saw this. She said she didn't know what they were doing, but that same-sex relationships were prohibited, and she was a citizen of the empire. Rasika, with wide eyes, ordered them to let her go to the ground and stop talking nonsense. It was a very uncomfortable situation, and His Majesty said it would only take a few minutes to go crazy. Farah apologized for not being able to stay until the end of the celebration, and Rasika said it was no big deal. She remembered that after the incident with Haram, her fate upon returning to Vita would be disastrous. Farah never thought that one day she would become the ruler of Vita, and always considered herself just a princess. Rasika said that if you give birth to a king when you are a child, you cannot forget it for a minute. Farah said that her brother's death was like a weight lifted off her shoulders, and that, if it were up to her, she would strangle him herself. She asked Rixit to convey forgiveness for her brother, and learned that they even had to make a bet on a magic stone. Rasika asked them not to worry, and they sent her a letter that should arrive at any moment. Farah turned abruptly and stared at Princess Rasika, who asked her what was wrong. She said she remembered that Rasika had said she would become a good ruler, and would keep her word. That conversation inspired her a lot, and she never thought she would be able to make her dream come true. Rasika smiled and said she believed in her and wanted her to act, not dream. Farah wanted to return her kindness, but Rasika said the best thing she could do was govern with dignity. Princess Levita smiled and thanked Princess Rasika for her kind words. The warriors of the north didn't forget kindness and gave the princess a necklace. But they didn't expect it to look beautiful. It was a necklace made with tusks of a northern wild boar. It didn't look like much. But it was their first boar, and that meant a lot. Rasika said she could have gotten any precious stone, but this necklace was special. Farah asked her to think of her more often, and said that she would always respond to any request for help. She promised to make Vita a strong country, and when she ascends to the throne, she will definitely be useful. Farah continued hugging Princess Rasika and promised she would never forget her. The rogue smiled sweetly and said she would never forget Princess Farah either. Farah couldn't contain her emotions and kissed the pink-haired girl right on her little forehead. Rasika was happy to now have a very good relationship with Princess Lavita. The rogue froze and heard the loud sound of stomping feet, and they were coming directly toward her. The Archduke grabbed Rasika into his arms right before the eyes of the surprised Princess Lavita. The rogue slapped her forehead with her palm and asked His Majesty how he could be so stupid. She asked Rixit if she had given him a completely impossible mission. Rasika just wanted him to approach Princess Farah, but he went and ruined everything with his words. Although things didn't go according to plan, the con artist wasn't angry with His Majesty because she expected such behavior. She was furious because he interfered in her farewell, and because she was the one doing all the dirty work. She apologized to Farah and said that His Majesty had simply misunderstood everything. Farah smiled, looking at Rasika, and said that His Majesty took very good care of her. Rixit blushed and began to rub his nose, saying that he was her protector. Rasika was not sure about this fact. Farah said that they were very compatible. Rixit asked if it was because of their beauty that they were compatible. Rasika looked at him askance and asked if he at least wanted to be a little modest now. The rogue asked to say that Farah was joking and said that they only had a business relationship, and added that His Majesty was not at all to her liking and looked askance at Rixit. Princess Lavita laughed out loud at this sweet scene, especially when His Majesty repeated the question. Although they argued until the end, Princess Lavita still considered Rixit a good person. Rasika reported that this was just the first step of the plan, and that her head was already about to burst. The pink-haired girl asked Rixit what holiday it was today, which made him very talkative. He said that for the first time he was so nervous and embarrassed, and it seemed that nothing was impossible for him. Rixit began to rejoice, but the rogue explained to him that that was not a compliment at all, but quite the opposite. She repeated that she had entrusted him with a simple task, and that it was simply necessary to approach Princess Farah. Rasika didn't understand that she wanted to demand something from a man who couldn't stand a simple phrase about the firmament. Rixit said that he found it very easy to say things with words, but that he had never known how to lie well. She reminded him that when he practiced with her everything was fine, he forgot about himself, and almost said it to her. Rixit corrected himself and said that bright stars really shone in her eyes, like in the sky. Rasika watched as His Majesty held his fingers over his eyes and wondered what to do. Both felt embarrassed and turned away, wondering how to act after what had just happened. Rasika thought about this and thought how suspicious it was, because he didn't embarrass her on purpose. Rixit was not that meticulous, which is why he said this without even realizing the visible facts. He had never had experience with girls, and his new feelings left him confused. Rosika realized that she had problems, and the business framework in her practice had never gone beyond that. The scandalous romance between the con artist Viper and the Archduke Rixit, that should never have happened. Rosika gave him a jar with a minimum dose of poison and asked him to drink it as quickly as possible. Rixit drank the bottle and thought he simply had to find a first lady with a good pedigree. He turned to the pink-haired advisor and asked her to listen, and she happily agreed. He brought the bottle to his mouth and asked the rogue what kind of guys she liked back then. She felt an electric shock run through her and asked why he had decided to ask her such a personal question now. After this question, there was silence in the room, and they looked at each other while sitting on the sofa. Rosika asked why Rixit was interested in such a strange question now. He said she shouldn't think anything. Since he was responsible for security, Rosika didn't see the connection. His Majesty informed her that he also needed to find the right partner to marry. He said he would find the right man for her and that she shouldn't date just anyone. Rixit once again asked the pink-haired advisor what kind of guy she would like to see by her side. Rosika said that initially he needs to be an extraordinarily handsome man. The rogue liked young, tall, and well-built men who took good care of themselves. It couldn't just be a handsome, muscular guy. He also had to have a lot of money. Rixit realized she knew what she was worth. The rogue said that is the most important thing. Otherwise, the guy won't have a chance. She approached Rixit and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands, and before he could do it, he asked her what the rule was. Rosika began to kiss His Majesty, who was very surprised by this event. She pulled away abruptly from the Archduke, who was surprised by that quick kiss. She gave him a very playful look and said her boyfriend had to be very intelligent. Rixit felt as if he had been doused with ice water. He looked at Rosika with his mouth open. The rogue said this on purpose, and, holding back laughter, looked at His Majesty and his reaction. She took his chin with her finger, and Rixit informed her that he had heard the little rascal perfectly. He thought about it and said it was a bit difficult, but Rosika said it was basically impossible. Rosika asked him if he agreed with her, even though he had given her his word that he would find a suitable partner for her. The rogue said she was very moved and told His Majesty she could trust him. Rixit stopped smiling and told the surprised con artist he was no longer sure of that. He said it would be difficult to find such a person, and that most likely she would have to be alone. Rosika said it was quite cruel and that perhaps, if he tried, he could find someone. Rixit said no one would find her, and that she should live alone. He was very angry about that fact. He announced he was leaving and, slamming the door hard, left the pink-haired rogue's room. Rosika observed the situation and realized that for the second day, she hadn't been able to say goodbye to her normally. Rixit lay in his bed under the watchful gaze of his hired assassin, the butler. Owen asked what he was doing there anyway, and if His Majesty was sick. Then he should call a doctor. Rixit, who was looking at the ceiling, asked the butler with embarrassment if he had been intelligent since his birth. Owen was bewildered by this question and asked His Majesty to clarify it again. Rixit kept repeating in his head the words of Rosika, who said that the guy had to be intelligent. His Majesty was hysterical, lying in bed, and Owen was very surprised by his master's behavior. He asked him what was really wrong with him. Rixit had really gone crazy. Rixit reported that he had a fever and a headache. The butler decided to call a doctor, or better yet, Rosika immediately. Rixit shouted that he didn't want that. The butler said the patient needed a doctor, and he was not his assistant. Owen reported that, judging by all the symptoms, His Majesty was suffering from a real fever of love. Rixit jumped up and began to say it wasn't her, but the butler said he had other things to do. His Majesty wanted to argue with the butler, but he had a severe headache, and he couldn't answer. The butler was very worried and began to ask Rixit where and how it hurt. He got very close to His Majesty and began to ask him how he felt, worrying a lot. Rixit held his chest with his hand and was very red. He really felt very sick. The butler hugged his master and asked if he really felt that bad. Rosika reported that nothing happened yesterday and she thought everything was fine, but still side effects appeared. Sweat ran down Rixit's veins, and it was evident that he felt really very sick. Even outwardly, His Majesty was all red, lying down with his eyes closed and groaning a little from pain. The rogue remembered that he pretended to be strong, but lost consciousness from just a drop of poison. She touched his wet forehead and asked him if His Highness was going to the other world. Rasika saw him regain consciousness a little and informed him that the poison was causing him side effects. She said the body stubbornly rejected the poison and it was necessary to stop. But Rixit shouted that it was impossible to stop. He said it wasn't the poison that made him feel sick and that he wanted to keep taking it to improve his immunity. She didn't understand what Rixit was muttering and repeated that he had gotten sick only because of the poisons. The rogue gave him a cup and told him to drink the herbal healing infusion she had prepared. Rixit felt great pain, but it was clear that he was happy to see the pink-haired rogue in his room. Rasika, holding a cup of tea, realized this and looked at the suffering Archduke. She felt embarrassed by his gaze and began to look away so as not to look. Rixit didn't want this and took her hand to look at her blue eyes again. He pulled her and the cup toward the bed and began to press his body against hers. Rasika closed her eyes and, holding the tea, asked what kind of position His Majesty had chosen. He took her hand, which had a magic ring, and told her he had a difficult request. Rixit said it was very difficult to find one, so she should remove the last item from her list. Rasika asked him if it was necessary to talk about this with a fever and asked him to compose himself. Rixit continued saying that we need to look for a person who is not so intelligent. But who is diligent? She hoped he wouldn't say that because she met the first criterion, but not the last. Rasika asked him if he himself was trying to fit into the criteria of the match for a con artist like her. She asked Rixit to say something and stop looking at her and remaining silent, and waited for an answer. Rasika began to ask if he liked her, and then asked if he had dated girls before. He got up to get closer and told the embarrassed girl that he liked her. The pink-haired advisor blushed deeply and felt embarrassed after such a declaration from Rixit. He said he didn't understand why he was in love with her and that he had never loved her. And Rasika said he had gone too far. Rixit raised both arms to hug the little rascal tighter and asked if she had heard just now. He hugged her tight and said that when she lay like that, his heart wanted to jump out of his chest. Rixit asked if this was a side effect of ingesting poison to strengthen the immune system. He kept asking why he was attracted to the pink-haired rogue's room, and if it was worth breaking her legs. Rasika asked to stop saying such terrible things as if nothing had happened. Rixit said that when he looked at her, his damn hands moved on their own. He clenched his fist and said he really wanted those hands to feel his rogue. He said this so she would understand correctly. It didn't mean he wanted to touch her. It was something completely different. He just wanted to keep Rasika close to him. Rixit reported that it was quite strange, but the rogue reported that she understood everything perfectly. His Majesty began to say it was not because he liked her a lot. She agreed and said that probably the problem wasn't that, but something else. Rasika said it was because of very close contact and that it happened for the first time. She asked him not to worry and promised him it would soon end and pass. Rasika looked at His Majesty, and he agreed with her words and said that would be good. The sick Archduke decided that was the best thing he could tell the pink-haired rogue. She made a decision for herself, even if all the men in the world loved her. She couldn't have Rixit. He must become emperor and marry a lady worthy of his status, and he can move mountains for his beloved. Rixit apologized to the advisor and said that he himself didn't understand what he was saying. He said he had a fever and was saying nonsense. The rogue said everything would pass soon and asked him to go to sleep. She closed His Majesty's bedroom door and, lowering her head, began to think about what was happening. The rogue saw the butler pushing a cart and said she had asked to add a little sugar to her tea. The butler said he didn't know Marco's ferocity and reported that His Majesty had already fallen asleep. Owen turned to the rogue and asked her to ask him some questions about the subject. He began to ask what poison she had used to help His Majesty, and she admitted it was saliva. The butler realized it was the saliva that gave her the name Viper, and that her kiss could be called the kiss of death. Rasika said he flatly refused to drink the saliva, and they couldn't find another way to transfer it. Owen realized why His Majesty had been hitting his fists against the walls the previous night. That explained many things. The butler said the knight went crazy after the kiss and became distracted, and that he had many things to do. Rasika said not to worry because she knew how to separate her personal life from work matters. Owen said he didn't say anything and that if people lived under the same roof, anything could happen. The butler was surprised when the rogue said they definitely couldn't have had a relationship of that kind. She thought that, even if she swam in money, nothing would change in both lives. She had belonged to the lower class. that back then she had to live with a single mother and a brother, that now she lived among orphans. Rixit, who inherited blue blood, and her, who didn't even have the status of a slave, lived in another world. She understood that the Cinderella story had always been just a fairy tale to her. And she didn't believe in miracles. His Highness will occupy the highest position in the empire and needs a wife at his height. Since things didn't work out with Princess Farah, we will look for the next girl to fill this role. She looked at Owen and asked if he would approve of her decision and agree with the facts. Rixit was dressed in beautiful clothes and told Rasika that they didn't look good on him at all. She informed him that it was time for him to get used to it, and that he would have to communicate with aristocrats from all over the country. Rixit said he understood, and that he had done quite well. Rasika praised His Majesty, saying he was a good man, and asked him to continue in the same way. A guard with a spear came running, and asked for the attention of His Highness the Archduke. He reported that there was a hooded figure standing at the door who could not be shown to the nobles, and had been waiting for 4 hours. According to this person, she knew Rixit and would only reveal her identity to him. The guard asked Rixit and the princess if they should have sent this guest away. The guard brought in a mysterious hooded figure and introduced her to His Majesty the Archduke. Under the hood, long hair and the silhouette of a blonde girl in poor condition could be seen. Rixit saw the person and assumed the girl standing in front of him with the princess was the one. She had a big belly, and it was most likely that the person in the hood was pregnant. She began to take the hood off her head and greeted His Majesty Archduke Rixit. The girl took off the hood, and in front of them appeared a girl with large green eyes and long hair. Rixit was very surprised when he saw this girl in front of him and couldn't believe his eyes. He grabbed her hand and started asking her how she had gotten there and if everything was okay with her. The young woman wanted to tell His Majesty what had happened, but he asked her to tell him personally, and looked at the rogue. It was clear that Rixit didn't want the con artist to hear what the girl was saying. Rasika was also surprised when she saw how strangely Rixit was behaving in the presence of a pregnant woman. He sent Rasika home and told her that he would come to see her soon and tell her everything. She asked His Highness to stop and waved her hands and tried to stop him. In the room were Masha, Rixit, and a pregnant girl. Masha asked His Majesty to calm down. The girl had a scratch on her shoulder, and Masha asked her what had happened to her to be in that condition. She said she met some strange people and that they were most likely trying to kill her. Rixit was going crazy from what he heard, and the girl apologized for coming here with such a problem. He said it was very good that she was there, and she knew she had nowhere else to go. Rixit listened as his pregnant friend told him that strange people had been following her the whole way. The mercenaries released the pregnant woman, and some rats and assassins appeared in his lands. They could have purposefully overlooked the exact place where she would go to escape. She cried and told how difficult it was for her to escape from the people who were attacking her. The young woman put her hand on her stomach and said she really wanted to see His Majesty. Rixit looked at her and asked her to stop worrying and go to his room to rest. He asked Masha to take care of her, and he himself was going to go see the princess and explain the situation. Rasika walked down the hall and tried to figure out who this girl could be. She didn't like that Rixit hid her existence, even though they promised to share all their secrets. The rogue was very surprised when she saw the maid Masha in His Majesty's chambers. It struck her like lightning when she saw that he was taking the pregnant woman not to the guest room, but to his own. She was also surprised that this girl knew Masha. She entered the room and greeted the girl. The girl saw Princess Rasika and couldn't say a word because she was very afraid of her. The princess apologized and said she had come to see His Highness. The young woman informed her that he had just left. Rasika said the girl was pregnant and that she shouldn't worry. She explained that she had recently joined Drax and had become his princess. The rogue asked the frightened young woman what her name was, and she said she could be called Sina. Rasika was delighted and said that name was very pretty and she liked it a lot. She asked if Sina was His Highness's beloved. This interested her a lot. The young woman denied it, and the rogue said she thought she was pregnant by His Majesty. Sina grabbed her belly and explained that that is far from true and that everything is much more complicated. Rasika asked how long and when she would give birth, and she really wanted to nurse the baby and hoped he wouldn't have golden eyes. His Highness asked her to stay in the castle. Rasika was happy about this and asked her what name she would give her child. Sina caressed her belly and explained that the father had given the baby a name beforehand, and she smiled at this. Rasika said it was very sweet, but what she really wanted was to know the name of the baby's real father. Sina said that if it's a boy, he will be named Rowan, and if it's a girl, they will give her the beautiful name Rasika. The rogue asked again, and Sina repeated that the boy was named Roan, and the girl would be called Rasika. She remembered how His Majesty had given her the name Rasika and looked away embarrassed. Rixit said that was exactly the name he wanted for his first child, and the little rascal found a connection. Sina was very happy when she shared the names, and Rasika began to laugh hysterically after that. The girl got scared and called the princess, who was hanging there, and she told her that the children had very pretty names. She said it didn't matter if it was a girl or a boy, but she wanted a girl and to call her Rasika. The rogue was once again suspended in time. When she heard this name, thousands of lightning bolts went through her. She smiled at the pregnant woman, but in her head, she understood that Rixit had been lying to her all this time. He lied saying that he had never dated girls and that he had never loved anyone. And she didn't understand that he had brought her there. That same Rixit lied to her at every turn, simply to mock the rogue's feelings. Rasika looked toward the door, which was being knocked on hard, and a loud crash was heard. And commotion. The door opened, and His Majesty and Masha appeared from there, asking them not to run under any circumstances. Masha saw the lady and asked when she arrived, which surprised Rixit a lot. And her. The rogue asked the pregnant woman to take a bath and rest well. The girl said goodbye to the princess. The con artist tried to leave the room as quickly as possible and didn't pay attention to Rixit. Masha and His Majesty watched with great surprise as the princess ran out of the room. Rixit took the fleeing princess by the hand and asked her to calm down while he explained everything. She wanted to deal with Rixit from the beginning, who was looking at the princess very guiltily. His Majesty said he had followed her, but apparently they didn't meet, and asked what they had been chatting about with the pregnant woman. She said she found out everything, and that she was especially impressed to know whose child she was expecting. Rixit was surprised that she told her that on their first meeting, and wondered if she had a brain. Rasika looked at the Archduke with horror, and wondered what kind of red flag that was. She said that in that case, he wouldn't have to explain everything, and asked what they should do next. Rasika said she was carrying the heir to the throne in her womb, and asked why Rixit hadn't told her. He replied that he didn't know it himself. She was surprised that His Majesty knew nothing about the pregnancy, and he confirmed that he didn't know. He said that unfortunately on the path to the crown one must establish priorities. Rasika was very surprised when she heard these words come out of Rixit's mouth. She didn't understand how someone could be so cruel to their beloved due to their low status in society. Rixit took the rogue by the hands and began to ask her if everything was okay with her now. He quickly pulled his hands away, and she ordered His Majesty not to touch her under any circumstances. Rasika said she needed to think about what she would do with this next. She said she didn't know if she had informed him, but her brother also knew that Sina was pregnant. The second brother sent mercenaries after her to get rid of her. The rogue was afraid that the mercenaries might come here too. The Archduke felt disturbed by this story, and Rasika couldn't grasp that everyone was in danger. Apart from her, everyone knew about her, even Masha, apparently, and everyone around them was gossiping about when they met. Rixit surprised the pink-haired rogue when he revealed to her that they had met when he lived in the palace. Sina arrived in the north 15 years ago, and Rasika asked if they had already been in a relationship for 10 years. Rixit was worried because the rogue couldn't stand on her feet and asked if the pregnant woman was a lady-in-waiting. He said she was from the southern part of the empire, from Chelia's, and Rasika heard that she was also a foreigner. 20 years ago, she was one of the slaves who was dedicated to the imperial family for the sake of her country's dignity. The rogue began to lose consciousness, and Rixit caught her and then said he understood her, and didn't know what to do either. He asked her to worry and promised her they would definitely come up with something. And the little rogue murmured that she wouldn't give in to difficulties. Rasika looked menacingly at His Majesty and said she had to speak her mind. She said she was disappointed with Rixit's humanity, even though she herself was the most famous con artist. Rasika continued and said he should have shown his true face immediately, instead of hiding behind some kind of innocence. Rixit didn't understand why she said such words and said he himself didn't know Sina would come here. She laughed and said he had been dating a slave for over 10 years. He had got her pregnant, and now she was out of business. Rasika said that if he treated slaves' lives as things, then he was no different from Prince Harren. Rixit apologized for pressing the princess too hard, but said her words had hurt him deeply. Rasika continued and asked if he thought people would welcome such an heir with flowers. The Archduke couldn't understand what she was talking about. She called him irresponsible and said that even if he became emperor, it was necessary to maintain his image and dignity. Rasika said everything must be told from the beginning and that she was not afraid to take responsibility. She said he should have told her immediately about his pregnant mistress and that he would have put both of them on the throne. Rasika continued saying that she wouldn't dare refuse him since he was an archduke. She asked him not to scare her and began to ask him why he suddenly started shouting at her. Rixit started saying out loud that that was not his child and that he had never held any other girl's hand besides her. He started saying that it was all Raven's fault and that this was the crown prince's daughter. He had loved this girl since childhood. Rasika completely lost touch with reality and said that even she was in shock today. He lifted her into his arms, and the little rascal started asking what His Majesty was doing at that moment. Rixit explained that he was worried she would faint after the shocking news, and that she needed to recover. He asked her to try to calm down and told her he would take her to her room. Rixit asked what they were talking about, that there had been a misunderstanding. The rogue said that the name Rasika had knocked her unconscious. His Majesty exhaled and explained that he apologized very much for that uncomfortable moment. Sina said that the father chose the children's names, and the little rascal asked if it was the crown prince. Raven often talked about such things and said he didn't have female friends, and that's why he didn't know any pretty names. Rasika apologized and said she got carried away because she thought he was talking about him. He said he really didn't have any of that, and that he wouldn't have any problems with ladies. Rasika thought that Sina didn't know about Raven's death, and that it was necessary to hide it from her for the child's safety. When His Majesty first saw Sina, he didn't pay attention to her, but he noticed when Raven took her. She had just arrived in the north at that time, and that was about 10 years ago at that time. The castle was in chaos. Rixit knew that her last life had taken place in the central area of the country, and that mercenaries had chased her to the north. He kept saying the name of the pregnant Sina, and wondered if he and the princess could trust her. First, you must wait and watch her. It will be enough if only the rebel suspects. Rixit said he didn't know exactly when they would attack Sina, and that it was necessary to reinforce defenses. Rasika apologized for the misunderstanding and asked not to worry about it. Rixit looked at the rogue and asked her why she said that and what decision she had made. The rogue liked the fact that she had been sent there on purpose and hoped to catch the criminals. Rasika laughed and asked His Majesty to grant her a bonus for the good work. She asked Rixit for a very, very expensive and shiny thing that was difficult to get. Rixit said that getting the star from the sky wouldn't be easy, but it would be the best option. Rasika felt embarrassed and told His Majesty that she also liked that beautiful option. The rogue said she would be in her workshop and asked for a butler to be sent there. They began to review all the available books, and Owen, sighing, prayed to the Lord. Rasika asked him to take off his vest and lower his shirt a little so that his ear was visible, and his neck. He was worried that she had suddenly done it again and reminded her that he had already said she wasn't his type. Rasika looked at the smiling butler and asked him if he was sure he wasn't tired of these jokes. He uncovered his shoulder, and the little rogue said the prince had an old scar between his shoulder and his ear. She applied a makeup brush, and the butler asked her to warn him in advance about touching it. Rasika laughed and said it was okay, that she would touch it a little today. She explained that the scar was barely visible there, and if it was worth going into so much detail. Other people might not know something so small, but she was sure that Sina definitely knew it. She said His Highness would arrive in the middle of the performance, and therefore wouldn't stay with her for long. Rasika said she would have to meet the imperial family, and that it would be a rehearsal. He laughed and said that lovers knew each other well. Owen decided that everyone really hoped the master wouldn't get close to the throne. Could the situation get worse? Rasika said everything would be fine, and that this was a great opportunity. The butler didn't understand. Most likely there was someone behind Sina, who was as influential as Raven's killer. It is necessary to find out who this person is, so the rogue will be grateful if the butler finds out. Owen considered how necessary it was, and said he was sure Reed was behind it. Rasika said the ruling elite should bow to Rixit for protecting the country from barbarian incursions. Even if someone else ascends to the throne, they will still need Rixit's protection. It made no sense to insist on His Majesty, because Ride was already second in the succession to the throne. The real culprit was the one after Rixit in the line of succession to the throne. The butler said that made sense, but it raised another question. He asked if they intended to send him to the Middle Lands, specifically to rid Van Hexen. She hit the table with the palm of her hand and asked him if he was sure he hadn't intended to raise Rid to the throne. Rosika said that the assassin's task didn't matter to her. More important was raising Rixit to the throne. Raven's body will be delivered to the central estate. The members of the imperial family will witness it. The criminal will manage to escape, but the body will remain there and no clear evidence will be found. However, in this case, Right Van Hexen would completely lose his right to inherit the throne. The butler pointed out that this was not just a plan to clear His Majesty of false accusations. The rogue would have to get rid of Right sooner or later, as he was second in the line of succession to the throne. She threw her gloves on the floor and said it was only a matter of time. Rowanik, a newspaper supplier from the north, met with Rosian, whom he hadn't seen for a long time, and asked him how he was. The young man greeted his uncle and informed him that he had significantly increased the number of workers. He said that, on the contrary, he was short of staff as his business expanded, and he was achieving success. The man wiped his tears with a handkerchief and told the boy that he had achieved everything only thanks to him. He asked if the celebration in honor of the princess had already passed a long time ago, or if he was unaware of something. The boy nodded and said he had brought some very interesting materials for him today. The director, seeing the titles, was filled with joy, anticipating their usefulness. He studied every word well and reported that they were wonderful and had very fruitful content. The man was very happy when he saw that among the papers there was even a photo of Rixit and the king of Vita. The uncle was very happy because he almost died, but the boy was very afraid for him. The boy hoped he wouldn't ignore the newspaper matter, and his uncle offered him to eat something sometime. A white carriage with a pair of horses arrived, and he said that perhaps, and now they were waiting for him. The boy opened the creaky carriage door and saw a man in a black cloak sitting in it. He asked if the figure with the cloak and hood was hot, and added that it was now midsummer. The cloak was skillfully removed, and underneath was the real Archduke Rixit with a serious face. He said he would probably never get used to his new scarred child face. The boy started kissing Rixit, but he shooed him away saying he found it disgusting. Then the guy started laughing evilly and tearing the mask near his neck to take it off. As soon as he took off the mask, the advisor's luxurious pink hair was immediately visible. Holding a brown cap in her hands, she asked if she could approach Rixit dressed like that. The driver laughed and said there was nothing wrong with a handsome guy holding onto him. It was a butler in disguise, and Rosika said apparently he was tired of the life of a handsome man by birth. His voice was different due to the borak poison that actively changed the vocal cords of the person taking it. Rixit was surprised by this, and the rogue explained to him that she had slightly swollen vocal cords. She said she used this method when she needed to pretend to be an adult man. Rosika reported that a low voice is very convenient for convincing various women. Rixit started to insult and say it was quite disgusting to hear that and asked her to stop. He knew she hadn't become a con artist for money, but that she had simply been born with that talent. Rixit looked at the pink-haired beauty and thought about what he would do if she suddenly decided to walk away from him. His Majesty got goosebumps, and the princess didn't understand why he was behaving so strangely. He secretly thanked his father for having given him this ring so he could meet the rogue. Rixit asked why she needed the magic scroll and was worried that she would break it and run away. He showed her a magic rune on his hand and reminded her that she wouldn't be able to run very far, but that she would have to crawl. He said that for a person who took the solution without knowing if it was poison or medicine. He had many suspicions, and the scroll was for Sina. Rixit saw that the rogue sensed, but didn't understand what she meant when she said her name. She explained that the teleportation scroll was available for everyone to use, and that the best merchants in the kingdom had just brought their goods. Chairs. Rosika hoped they had brought at least one, and was worried that they might have already sold it. Rixit said the scroll was worth a whole fortune, and that it was unlikely anyone had managed to buy it yet. Rosika said she hadn't seen markets like that for a long time, and that she hoped to find many things worth having. His Majesty smiled looking at the cheerful princess, and was very happy to see her like that. He said that normally the merchants came with jewelers, and it pleased the little rogue a lot who was thinking about jewels. They continued looking at each other like a couple in love and were very embarrassed by it. Rasika began to look out the window and blushed, humming a simple song. Rixit looked at the pink-haired con artist and asked her why she liked gold so much. She remained silent and continued to look mysteriously out the window, resting her chin on the road. He thought she was a con artist who knew how to deceive others, but the fact that she couldn't hide her emotions in moments like these was cute. Rixit was surprised thinking when he said the word cute and started to feel very embarrassed in his head. She started covering her lips and thinking about how sweet it all was, and it amused the little rogue. Her eyes lit up, and she asked if they would buy the scroll and look at the other products. She started asking Rixit if they would definitely buy it or just look at it. Rixit nodded and said that if she wanted it, they would buy it. She shouted with joy and told His Majesty that he was the best in the world. The carriage stopped abruptly, and the butler informed his passengers that they had reached their destination. Rasika would have already wanted to put on the mask, but Rixit asked her to wait for him in the carriage. He asked why they both needed to get out. He could buy the scroll himself and return. The rogue doubted His Majesty's abilities and asked if he could really do it alone. Rixit got nervous and asked what was wrong and why she didn't believe in him. She said she was worried about the Archduke and thought he might be deceived, which enraged him. He didn't understand why he couldn't just buy it and come back, and the rogue said that the scroll cost a lot of money and that there were risks. Rasika asked His Majesty if he even knew the market price established on the continent. He shouted that he would prove he could buy the scroll and asked her to wait for him until he returned. Rixit was at the store, and the guy specified that he needed a scroll that could move across the entire continent. The seller showed him a scroll from the kingdom of Eisenbach with it. He could forget about mana leakage. Rixit looked at the scroll with the seal, calculated the years of its publication, and concluded that it was quite new. The type of summoning magic was described in a scroll using the ancient language of the kingdom, and only a few could read it. Eisenbach confirmed the authenticity of the scroll by placing a seal that supposedly responded to mana. Rixit said he had a magic stone with him and could control mana a little. He took out the stone and began to manipulate it, and the room began to shine with a red light. Rixit realized that the scroll was genuine. His Majesty clarified the price, and the seller, rubbing his palms together, named 80 million. Rixit thought it would be at least 100, and began to worry that it was very cheap for a scroll. The seller said that this was the only way to sell such products in the north, and that he would sell them even if it meant losing money. Rixit took the seller's word for it, and said he understood what he was talking about when he mentioned the north. His Majesty was very proud of himself after all. He bought an authentic scroll, and at a low price too. Suddenly a guy with a cap appeared and shouted, "Stop Rixit." He immediately realized it was Rasika. He asked if there were more scrolls like this, and how much they cost. The seller quoted a price of 80 million. The guy said that if there was only one to sell, then he should sell it to that person instead. He said he didn't have cash, but perhaps he could replace it, and showed a ring with a stone. Before coming to see you, he went to the jeweler, but he didn't want to pay as much as he expected. The seller knew that the jeweler was a known deceiver of simpletons and asked how much he had offered. The man said about 100 million, but thought the ring was worth more. The seller thought, how can that be? The seller realized that if the jeweler said so, then it was definitely worth at least double. Rasika, in disguise, looked mischievously at Rixit, and he tried to understand what she was planning. He started to get nervous and shake his head in dissatisfaction at the fact that they didn't trust him. Rixit felt offended and began to leave the shop, saying he was no longer interested at all. His Majesty was waiting for Rasika in the carriage and began to ask, what was she? He said the seller had neither shame nor conscience. Rixit asked her what she was talking about, and she told him that someone tried to deceive her, and that she was craftier than the deceiver. The scroll indicated that it only worked up to the middle of the continent, and indicated where it was written. Rasika said she bought this scroll only because that distance would be enough for Sina to be able to hide. Rixit got scared and asked why she had given away the ruby then, and Rasika said that she hadn't completely lost her mind yet. She said it wasn't a ruby at all, but a simple real stone that could be sold for 100,000. Rasika said that if the scroll only worked halfway, then it certainly wasn't worth that much. The butler Owen said, hello, to attract the attention of His Highness the Archduke. Rixit asked for 5 million as compensation for the hard work of the merchants of the island, who came to sell their products this year. His Majesty began to scold the rogue and explained to her that in the kingdom, such machinations are strictly punished. Rosika disagreed and said that he was the first who started to deceive honest people. That's why he didn't rebuke the rogue, but said that it was still necessary to pay for the scroll. Generally, people report this to the police instead of scamming sellers in return for being scammed. He started to touch the little rogue's cheek and tell her that it was time for her to stop sulking and move on with her life. Rixit confirmed that he had been deceived, but he couldn't escape this fate as he didn't know how to read the language. He started to ask how Rosika understood what was written in those scribbles. The rogue proudly said that she simply learned and could read this ancient language. Her intention was to steal the ring and escape there, while at the same time learning the local language. Rosika said she was tired of poverty and hoped to get rich there with magic objects. Rixit asked if she could cook brains too. They couldn't have been used for something. He said that today she was a good girl and that she could buy whatever she wanted at the jewelry store. Rosika said that since they had saved a lot of money today, they could spend a lot at the store. She said that the merchant himself was to blame for his own misfortune, and Rixit reminded her that he knew that very well. His Majesty said he simply wanted to spend all his money on her, and that was it.